Good morning, dear listener. It's Tuesday, August 26th, 2025 in New York. When the city that never sleeps still lingers in the quiet pause between yesterday's glitter and today's rush. You're easing into rest, but in the world of markets and headlines, the rhythm is uneasy. Only yesterday, investors were rattled as the president abruptly moved to dismiss a Federal Reserve. Governor an act that shook confidence in the independence of America's central bank and sent global shares trembling. At the same time, whispers grow louder that the Fed could begin cutting rates as early as September. A gentle admission that the labor market, once roaring, now feels fragile and tired. Growth looks strong in some numbers, yet the shadows tell another story. Consumer spending falters, tourism slips, and the sense of steady footing fades. If this feels hauntingly familiar, it is because America has danced this waltz before. Nearly a century ago, in 1929, the air was thick with optimism too. Credit stretched further than reason. Banks carried hopes heavier than their balance sheets, and speculation gleamed brighter than common sense. Back then, the headlines also offered contradictions. Some proclaiming strength, others whispering doubt until the music stopped and the Great Depression began. Tonight, we will not simply relive those days. Instead, we will wander gently between past and present, watching how the cracks of 1929 echo in the fractures of 2025. And as you drift further into rest, I will carry you through the story softly, step by step, till the ghost of the Depression reveals itself not as a monster, but perhaps as a guide, flickering a light on dangers still ahead. The city outside may hum with its usual confidence, but beneath the surface runs a quieter tension. Headlines speak of sudden political jolts shaking the Federal Reserve, traders shifting uneasily in their chairs, and policymakers wondering aloud if the medicine of lower rates must come sooner than planned. These tremors belong to our own time, yet they echo a far older rhythm. To understand why every market dips and shivers down spines, and why ordinary people watch their wallets with unease, we must wander back almost a century, to an age when optimism was a currency as common as the jazz drifting out of nightclubs, and when skyscrapers gleamed like monuments to endless growth, until October 1929 reminded the nation that illusions can dissolve faster than champagne bubbles at midnight. The Great Depression did not strike like lightning. It seeped slowly, a leak that widened until the whole structure gave way. The crash was merely the spark. Credit had already stretched too thin, banks were standing on fragile stilts, and families built lives on promises their wages could no longer keep. When the unraveling began, it carried millions into unemployment lines, into bread queues stretching around city blocks, and into a deep questioning of the American dream itself. Yet even amid the darkness, resilience flickered. Neighbors shared what little they had, mothers stretched meals out of scraps, and communities learned to survive together. Those sepia memories remain etched in history as proof that abundance can vanish. But human tenacity rarely does. Now, nearly 100 years later, our present moment seems to hum with similar unease. Inflationary pressures from tariffs and global strains, debt weighing heavy on households and governments alike. Consumer confidence dimming, and even the pulse of tourism slowing. These are not identical to the patterns of 1929, but they rhyme. The ghost that haunts us is not the literal shadow of that decade, but the familiar temptation to ignore warning signs until they swell too large to manage. And so, as we prepare to journey deeper into this story, I invite you to linger with me a little longer, to drift through the corridors of history where hope and despair intertwined, and to reflect on what lessons might still guide us today. And before we move forward, a gentle reminder: if you find comfort in these bedtime stories of history, a simple like or a quiet tap on the subscribe button helps keep this lantern glowing. It is a small gesture, but it tells the story that someone out there is listening, still awake, still curious, and perhaps even still hopeful. The decade that would later be remembered as the Roaring Twenties began like a symphony of progress, each note brighter than the one before. Across the United States, factories hummed, radios crackled with jazz, and automobiles rumbled down streets that only a few years earlier had belonged to horses and carts. In cities, neon lights painted the night sky in colors no previous generation had seen. And in small towns, families marveled at the power of electricity as though it were a kind of household magic. It was an age of invention and expansion, when people believed that technology and prosperity would only march forward, never backward. Wall Street became the altar where this faith was worshipped, and shares of companies from steel giants to automobile firms were bought not just by seasoned investors but by school teachers, farmers, and clerks who had never dreamed of entering the financial world. The newspapers told them they could become rich, and for a while it seemed as though they were right. Behind the glitter, however, was a fragile architecture. Credit was easy, sometimes recklessly so. Ordinary people who earned modest wages were encouraged to buy stocks on margin, meaning they borrowed money from brokers to purchase shares they could not afford outright. It was as if the entire economy had begun to balance itself on a tower of IOUs, beautiful while it stood, perilous. If shaken, banks, too, extended loans liberally, often without the reserves to back them. Historians, such as Charles Kindleberger, in his studies of financial manias, have noted that speculative bubbles often grow not because people fail to see the risks, but because they believe they can escape the collapse before others do. The late 1920s were no exception. Investors told themselves the party could last forever, and if it didn't, they would be clever enough to leave just before the crash. Meanwhile, beneath the urban glamour, farmers struggled. After the First World War, global demand for American crops fell sharply, leaving many rural families drowning in debt. While city dwellers danced the Charleston and toasted prosperity with champagne, farmers watched prices for wheat and corn tumble, and their barns echoed with a quieter despair. This uneven prosperity was a hidden crack in the facade, one that few policymakers in Washington were eager to address. President Calvin Coolidge famously said, "The business of America is business," a phrase that captured both the confidence and the blindness of the era. Business was thriving, but not for everyone, and those left behind were rarely considered until it was too late. It is easy, from the safety of hindsight, to imagine that the warning signs must have been obvious. Yet for those living in the late 1920s, optimism felt natural. The Great War had ended. Science was reshaping life with electricity, telephones, and even the first flickering films with sound, and wages in many industries were climbing. Why question the tide of progress? The stock market became the measure of national pride, and as long as it rose, the nation believed itself secure. Investors like Irving Fisher, one of the most respected economists of his day, declared in 1929 that stocks had reached a permanently high plateau. It was the kind of statement that history remembers less for its confidence than for its tragic irony. And so, the 20s glided on. As jazz bands played, skyscrapers rose, and tape machines clattered in Wall Street offices. Yet beneath the sound and sparkle was the faintest hum of fragility. A hum that would crescendo in October 1929. The Great Depression did not begin with breadlines or shuttered banks. It began here, in the illusion that prosperity was unshakable. If that sounds strangely familiar, it may be because today's America carries its own shimmering facade. In 2025, technology again dazzles, from artificial intelligence to space tourism, and markets have often risen on waves of enthusiasm rather than sober calculation. Debt levels, both public and private, weigh heavily, just as they did a century ago, And just as families in 1928 borrowed to buy stocks they could scarcely afford, many households today lean on credit cards and loans to maintain lifestyles that outpace their wages. The question, as always, is not whether prosperity itself is wrong, but whether it has been built upon a foundation too fragile to bear the weight of hope. As we drift into this first chapter of the tale, the lesson is not yet collapse, but caution. The roaring 20s shimmered with invention and possibility, but they also whispered a warning that unchecked optimism is a double-edged sword, offering both exhilaration and peril. In the next part of our story, we will follow the whispers into the final months before the crash, when the hum of fragility turned into a roar that no one could ignore. As the summer of 1929 slipped into autumn, New York shimmered with the confidence of a city convinced it had mastered fortune itself. Brokers in tailored suits crowded into the canyons of Wall Street, their voices rising above the clatter of ticker-tape machines that seemed to sing a hymn of endless wealth. On October mornings, sunlight caught the glass windows of new skyscrapers, reflecting the glow of prosperity back onto the streets below. Families from far beyond Manhattan had joined the market's dance. Teachers, shopkeepers, and small barbers all held shares in companies they barely understood, urged on by a belief that stocks could only march upward. The nation seemed to be breathing in rhythm with the Dow Jones Index, its highs and lows mirrored in the pulse of daily life. Margin loans, once a tool for seasoned investors, had become a bridge to dreams for ordinary Americans. With just 1/10 of the money needed, anyone could buy a stock and hope to repay the loan when the shares climbed. Brokers themselves were borrowing to fund this tidal wave of speculation, creating a chain of debts that bound households to banks, and banks to each other. In hindsight, historians, such as John Kenneth Galbraith, would later describe this system as an intricate tower built of paper and promises, dazzling in its height, but destined to sway. Yet at the time, the spectacle of easy riches silenced most doubters. Those who warned of danger were dismissed as pessimists unwilling to join the celebration. Even politicians basked in the glow. President Herbert Hoover, newly inaugurated in March 1929, declared with characteristic optimism that the future of the nation is bright with promise. His words rang out only months before the market began its sharpest decline, an irony not lost on generations since. Newspapers echoed the cheer, filling their pages with stories of fortunes made overnight, of ordinary men who became investors and believed themselves captains of destiny. This was not merely economics, it was theater, and Americans of every stripe had bought a ticket. But in quieter corners, cracks widened. Industrial production, after years of rapid expansion, had begun to slow. Farmers, already crushed by falling crop prices, saw no relief. Car sales softened, inventories piled up, and steel output faltered. The music was still playing, but some instruments were falling out of tune. Abroad, tremors in economies from Germany to South America sent subtle ripples through American markets, a reminder that prosperity was not a fortress but a web of fragile connections. Still, the dominant mood was one of denial. The belief that prosperity was permanent became a kind of national faith, and to question it felt almost unpatriotic. Irving Fisher's infamous proclamation about stocks reaching a permanently high plateau was not a lonely remark, but an anthem repeated in offices and drawing rooms alike. Wall Street's brokers continued to extend credit, the Federal Reserve hesitated to intervene decisively, and the cycle spun ever faster. For the ordinary American, the scene was both thrilling and confusing. A schoolteacher in Ohio, who had never before thought about the market, suddenly found neighbors talking about General Motors shares over Sunday dinner. A barber in Kansas might pin stock tips on the wall beside his clippers, offering haircuts and financial advice in the same breath. It was not greed alone that drove them, but a sense of inclusion, the intoxicating belief that they, too, could share in the abundance once reserved for the wealthy. Looking back from 2025, the resonance feels uncanny. Today, it is not margin, loans but credit cards, not ticker tape but smartphones glowing with apps that allow anyone to buy shares, cryptocurrencies, or fractional ownership of companies in seconds. Just as in 1929, the promise of easy access has blurred the line between prudent investing and reckless speculation. The stage is larger, the technology dazzling, yet the human impulses remain the same. Optimism, fear of missing out, and the quiet hope that prosperity will last forever. These are timeless players in the theater of finance. And so, as the autumn of 1929 deepened, America stood at the edge of a precipice it did not recognize. The skyscrapers still gleamed, the jazz still played, and ticker tapes still clattered in jubilant rhythm. But beneath the surface, debts tangled, like vines, and optimism, stretched thin, trembled like glass before the crack. The collapse had not yet come, but the air was heavy with its approach, as though the city itself sensed that the celebration was nearing its final dance. October arrived with the brisk bite of autumn, and with it came the unraveling of illusions. On Thursday, October 24th, 1929, the opening bell on Wall Street did not ring in another day of easy fortune, but the first notes of panic. Almost immediately, selling orders flooded the exchange. Brokers, who only days earlier had joked about endless prosperity, now shouted hoarse commands as the ticker tape lagged hopelessly behind the reality of plunging prices. Crowds gathered outside the New York Stock Exchange, straining to catch word of what was happening inside. Faces pale, hats clutched in nervous hands, they waited for news that seemed to come only in gasps. General Electric down, U.S. Steel falling, banks swamped with frantic calls. That day would be remembered as Black Thursday, the first crack in the facade. For a brief moment, relief arrived. A group of powerful bankers, meeting in secret at the offices of J.P. Morgan, announced they would step in to stabilize the market. They purchased large blocks of blue-chip stocks, a gesture meant to signal confidence, and prices steadied. Newspapers reassured readers that the worst was over, likening the intervention to the calm hand of the 1907 crisis, when financier J.P. Morgan himself had orchestrated a rescue. Many believed history had repeated itself for the better, that panic could be quelled and prosperity restored, but hope was short-lived. The following week, on Monday, October 28th, and especially Tuesday, October 29th, forever remembered as Black Tuesday, the market collapsed in earnest. The floor of the exchange dissolved into chaos. Shares of once mighty companies fell like stones. Margin calls spread like wildfire, and those who had borrowed heavily to invest saw their positions liquidated at devastating losses. The ticker tape could not keep up, printing figures hours behind reality, as if the machines themselves had surrendered. Outside, the crowd swelled into thousands. Some wept openly. Others cursed the bankers, the government, or fate itself. It was not just numbers that tumbled, but the collective dream of an America that had convinced itself it could only ascend. The scale was staggering. By the end of that week, billions of dollars in paper wealth had evaporated. Families who had believed themselves secure were left staring at statements that now amounted to nothing. A teacher who had invested her savings in telephone stocks saw her future erased in a matter of hours. A shopkeeper who had borrowed to buy shares of automobile companies now faced debts he could never repay. Newspapers carried images of brokers slumped in exhaustion, their collars undone, their eyes hollow. The myth of a permanent plateau was shattered, replaced by a chasm no one knew how deep it would become. Historians, such as Maury Klein and David Kennedy, remind us that the crash was not the depression itself, but the trigger. The economy had already been slowing, but the collapse destroyed confidence, dried up credit, and spread fear like wildfire across every sector. Banks that had lent freely now faced runs as depositors demanded their money. Factories cut production. Workers were dismissed, and a cycle of contraction began that would spiral downward for years. The Depression was not a single event, but a chain reaction, and Black Tuesday was the stone that set it rolling. From the perspective of 2025, the images seem strangely familiar, though the technology has changed. Today, it is not crowds outside, an exchange, but millions watching red numbers scroll across glowing screens. It is not ticker tape, but digital feeds refreshing by the second. Yet the psychology is the same. Panic begets panic. Confidence evaporates in an instant, and debt magnifies losses. In recent years, we have seen echoes of these dynamics in sudden market sell-offs, in the collapse of cryptocurrencies, and in the swift unraveling of speculative bubbles that seemed unstoppable only months before. The setting may be new, but the human story is not. As Black Tuesday bled into the weeks that followed, America stumbled into a new reality. The party of the Roaring Twenties was over, the music silenced, not by choice, but by collapse. The glitter of prosperity gave way to the gray of unemployment lines and shuttered shops. For millions, the dream dissolved into the daily question of how to eat, how to pay rent, how to endure. It was not merely an economic crisis, but a profound psychological break, a realization that the future could turn not upward, but downward, and that no one, not bankers, not politicians, not economists, seemed able to stop the fall. And as we lean closer into this chapter of history, it is worth asking, what do we see in our own time when markets shake, when debts pile high, and when confidence proves thinner than paper? The ghost of 1929 is not a relic of the past. It is a reminder, a whisper, that illusions are fragile, and that the line between prosperity and despair can be crossed in a single week. In the weeks after the crash, the glitter of Wall Street gave way to the grayness of uncertainty. At first, many Americans hoped the storm would pass quickly. Newspapers reassured readers that the fundamentals of the economy remained strong, that the panic was only a passing squall. But behind those optimistic headlines, cracks widened. Banks, which had lent recklessly during the boom, suddenly faced depositors clamoring to withdraw their savings. In towns across the nation, lines formed outside bank doors, men in worn coats, clutching withdrawal slips. Women clutching children, while glancing nervously at the heavy doors that might never open again. When one bank closed, fear spread to the next, and soon entire communities saw their lifelines vanish overnight. It is difficult to imagine the shock of those early failures. In an era before deposit insurance, a bank collapse meant more than inconvenience. It meant a lifetime of savings gone in a moment. Families who had trusted their local bankers suddenly found themselves penniless, their plans for homes, education, or retirement erased. Letters from the time, preserved in archives, speak of disbelief. How could an institution so solid yesterday dissolve into nothing today? The psychological toll was immense, as faith in the system itself eroded. People hoarded cash under mattresses, buried coins in backyards, or turned to barter when trust in paper currency faltered. As banks fell, businesses followed. Factories slowed production, then shut their doors altogether. By early 1930, layoffs multiplied and unemployment spread, like a shadow across cities and towns. Skilled workers who had once been proud providers now stood in breadlines, waiting silently for soup ladled out by churches and charities. Children remembered fathers leaving home each morning, not for work but to search for it, returning with the same weary shake of the head. Photographs from the era show men selling apples on street corners for a nickel, their dignity worn thin but not entirely gone. The Depression had begun to seep into the fabric of everyday life. President Herbert Hoover struggled to respond. a man of engineering brilliance and deep faith in self-reliance. He believed that voluntary cooperation, not government intervention, would restore stability. He urged businesses to maintain wages and avoid layoffs, hoping confidence alone might reverse the tide. Yet as months passed, optimism grew harder to sell. The machinery of the economy had stalled, and goodwill could not restart it. Historians such as David Kennedy, in Freedom from Fear, note that Hoover's philosophy of limited government left him ill-equipped for a crisis of this scale. His reluctance to provide direct aid earned him both criticism and a reputation for aloofness, though he was far from indifferent. For ordinary Americans, the gap between official reassurances and daily reality widened painfully. Newspapers might report that recovery was around the corner, but a mother in Chicago, trying to stretch a loaf of bread for her children, saw no such light. A farmer in Iowa, already battered by falling crop prices, now faced foreclosure as banks demanded payment on loans he could no longer meet. Communities organized makeshift support systems, trading food and clothing, sharing what little they had. But the sense of national prosperity that had defined the 1920s was gone, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty that reached every class, from the wealthy investor to the humble laborer. Looking at 2025, it is easy to feel a chill of recognition. While today's banks are bolstered by deposit insurance and regulations born from the lessons of the Depression, confidence remains a fragile currency. When regional banks faltered in recent years, the speed of digital withdrawals, moving at the click of an app, showed how panic still lives just beneath the surface. Debt, too, hangs heavy over households, and layoffs in key industries remind us that job security is never guaranteed. The ghost of 1929 whispers, not through ticker tape, but through screens glowing red with losses, through headlines about instability, and through the quiet fear of families wondering how long prosperity can last. By the end of 1930, it was clear that the crash had not been a passing storm, but the opening act of a long winter. The optimism of the Roaring Twenties was gone, and in its place lay an uneasy silence. Shuttered factories, silent workshops, empty storefronts. Yet amid the gloom, resilience began to stir. Neighbors shared food, churches organized aid, and communities learned to endure. The Depression had taken root, but so too had the stubborn determination to survive. And as America drifted deeper into the 1930s, the question was no longer whether recovery would come swiftly, but how long the darkness would last, and what sacrifices would be demanded before dawn could return. By the time the calendar turned to 1930, the illusions of a quick rebound had faded. The stock market, which some had hoped would stabilize after its violent plunge, continued to stagger downward like a wounded giant. Each small rally was followed by deeper losses, and investors who had clung to hope finally surrendered, selling at whatever price they could fetch. But the true tragedy of the Depression was not measured on Wall Street tickers. It unfolded in the daily lives of ordinary people across America. Factories that had once churned day and night now stood silent, their smokestacks cold against gray skies. Unemployment, which had been a mere 3% before the crash, soared past 9% by the end of 1930. And within another year, nearly 1 in 6 American workers would be without a job. Families that had once strolled proudly down main streets now shuffled in breadlines, their dignity pressed thin by hunger. In some cities, so many were homeless that makeshift shantytowns, sarcastically nicknamed Hoovervilles, after President Hoover, sprang up on empty lots in public parks. Cardboard, scrap wood, and tin became walls against the cold, fragile shelters for those who had nowhere else to go. The crisis was not contained by national borders. As American banks and businesses pulled back, the shockwaves rippled outward. Germany, still staggering under reparations from the First World War, found itself crushed as American loans dried up. Britain, France, and nations across Latin America suffered declines in trade, their industries throttled by the contraction of global demand. The Depression was no longer America's wound. It was the world's. Cambridge economic historians later described it as the first truly global economic crisis, binding together distant nations in shared suffering. In Washington, President Hoover clung to his faith in voluntary cooperation. He encouraged businesses to maintain wages and avoid layoffs, and he established programs like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to shore up banks and railroads. Yet these measures, limited and often too late, seemed like a drop in an ocean of despair. Hoover's reluctance to provide direct federal relief to individuals deepened public frustration. Too many, his policies felt like distant engineering calculations. Logical, perhaps, but heartless when measured against the sight of children with hollow eyes or fathers selling apples for pennies on the street. Meanwhile, nature itself conspired against recovery. In the Great Plains, years of over-farming and drought began to turn rich soil into dust, though the Dust Bowl would reach its full fury later in the decade. The early signs appeared in 1930 and 1931, as winds lifted topsoil into the air and carried it away, leaving farms barren. For rural families already battered by falling crop prices and foreclosures, this environmental blow felt like a cruel twist of fate. Letters from the time, preserved in collections like Voices from the Dust Bowl, speak of despair so deep that some farmers abandoned their land altogether, seeking uncertain futures in cities, already groaning under the weight of the unemployed. The psychological shift was profound. What had begun as a market crash was now understood as something far greater, a collapse of faith in the very system that had promised prosperity. Churches saw pews fill with the desperate seeking comfort, while protest movements began to stir in cities, demanding relief and reform. Police reports from 1931 describe marches of the unemployed, banners raised high, voices demanding work, not charity. America was awakening to the realization that this was no brief storm to be endured. It was a long winter that would demand sacrifice, resilience, and perhaps a fundamental reshaping of government's role in daily life. For us in 2025, the echoes are unsettling. While today's policymakers move more quickly with stimulus, rate cuts, and interventions designed to prevent catastrophe, the fragility of confidence remains unchanged. Whether in sudden bank runs triggered by digital whispers, or in families balancing rising debts against wages that refuse to keep pace with inflation, the specter of instability never vanishes. The Great Depression's early years remind us that the real danger is not always the initial shock, but the slow erosion of trust that follows. By 1931, America had entered uncharted waters. The crash was no longer just a memory. It was the beginning of a new era. Factories stood idle, homes were lost, and the promise of endless prosperity lay buried beneath hunger and dust. Yet even then, a stubborn resilience flickered. Neighbors shared food, communities organized relief, and voices began to rise, calling for change. The darkness deepened, but in that darkness seeds were planted for transformation. The Great Depression was here to stay, and the nation would never be the same again. When the glow of the Roaring Twenties finally dimmed, America awoke to a new reality that felt as though the floor had been ripped out from under everyday life. In 1930 and 1931, the numbers told part of the story. Millions of jobs gone, thousands of banks shuttered, wages slashed in half. But it was in the homes, kitchens, and streets of America that the true weight of the Depression was felt. Families accustomed to modest comfort suddenly found themselves calculating how to stretch a loaf of bread across an entire week. Children, who had once rushed to school with packed lunches, now lined up at charity kitchens, clutching tin cups for watery soup. In cities from Chicago to New York, the sound of the times was no longer jazz spilling from nightclubs, but the shuffle of weary feet in breadlines. The sense of dislocation was profound. A man who had worn a suit and tie to his office every day now spent his mornings waiting in an unemployment line, hat in hand, dignity unraveling 1 hour at a time. Women, who had stretched household budgets before, now became masters of improvisation, turning scraps into meals, patching clothes until the fabric nearly disintegrated. Letters written by families during these years often spoke of shame as much as hunger, the shame of asking neighbors for help, the shame of pawning wedding rings, the shame of children learning too early that their parents could not shield them from the cruelties of fortune. In rural America, the blow was even harsher. Farmers, already battered by collapsing crop prices, watched as creditors seized their land. Auction sales became grim spectacles, families forced to stand by as neighbors bid pennies for their tractors, horses, and furniture, while sheriffs enforced the law with stony faces. Some communities fought back with what became known as penny auctions, where local farmers would bid absurdly low prices and intimidate outsiders to keep foreclosed property in the hands of the original owner. These acts of quiet rebellion revealed not only desperation, but subtlety, recognition that survival required bending the rules that had betrayed them. The Depression reshaped the very geography of American life. Thousands of families took to the road in search of work, piling children and possessions into battered cars, drifting toward cities or across states, chasing rumors of jobs that rarely existed. Camps of the homeless spread across urban parks, the infamous Hoovervilles built from tin scraps, cardboard, and old wood. Journalists recorded the sight of families huddled around makeshift fires, children doing homework by candlelight in shacks that trembled with every gust of wind. These images seared themselves into the nation's consciousness, reminders that the land of abundance had become a land of want. Amid the hardship, there was resilience. Churches expanded soup kitchens, community groups organized clothing drives, and neighbors found ways to share what little they had. A farmer might leave extra potatoes at a neighbor's door. A baker might quietly slip a loaf of bread into the hands of a hungry child. The Depression tested the nation's moral fabric, and though cruelty and despair were common, so too were small acts of kindness that flickered like candles against the dark. The psychological toll was harder to measure, but no less real. Men, who had defined themselves by their ability to provide, felt crushed by failure, and suicide rates climbed. Young people delayed marriage, unsure how to build a future when the present was so uncertain. Yet, out of this crucible of despair, a kind of quiet toughness began to take root. Families learned to endure, to survive with less, to rely on one another. Historians such as Robert McIlvaine, in the Great Depression, America, 1929 to 1941, note that this period reshaped American attitudes toward wealth, poverty, and government, planting seeds of skepticism about unfettered capitalism and a longing for stronger safety nets. Looking from 2025, the echoes are striking. Today's families may not stand in breadlines, but food banks still swell with demand whenever economic shocks ripple through society. Credit cards and digital debt replace pawnshops. Yet the feeling of anxiety is the same. The uncertainty of whether tomorrow will bring stability or another slip toward hardship. Just as in 1930, people cling to the hope that government action, community support, or sheer resilience can keep them afloat. The early years of the Great Depression were more than statistics. They were a profound shift in how Americans understood themselves. Prosperity had been sold as a birthright, but now survival became the daily goal. The skyscrapers still rose over New York, the farmland still stretched across Iowa, but the dream felt thinner, more fragile, as if a single gust of wind could sweep it all away. In the silence, after the crash of prosperity, America entered a long and uncertain night. A night whose lessons still linger in the air we breathe, in the uneasy dawn of the 1930s. President Herbert Hoover faced a crisis unlike any other in American history, and he faced it with convictions formed long before the market collapsed. Hoover was no stranger to hardship. As a child, he had been orphaned, and through discipline and talent he rose to become a world-renowned engineer and humanitarian. During the First World War, he organized massive relief efforts that saved millions from starvation in Europe. To many Americans, he seemed the perfect leader for a nation in distress, practical, efficient, and steeped in the ethos of self-reliance. Yet the very qualities that made Hoover admirable also became shackles, binding him to a philosophy ill-suited for the scale of the Depression. Hoover believed deeply in what he called American individualism. To him, the strength of the nation came from voluntary cooperation among citizens, not heavy-handed intervention from Washington. He urged businesses to maintain wages, hoping that consumer demand would hold steady if paychecks did not vanish. He encouraged local charities, churches, and state governments to expand relief for the needy, insisting that federal aid would sap independence and dignity. In speeches, he reassured the public that prosperity was just around the corner, that the crisis was temporary, and that faith in the system would carry the nation through. But faith could not fill empty stomachs. As unemployment spread and breadlines lengthened, Hoover's words rang hollow. Families who had lost their homes could not survive on optimism. Farmers facing foreclosure could not be saved by voluntary cooperation. The gulf between Hoover's philosophy and the lived reality of millions grew wider by the month, and with it, frustration simmered. Political cartoons of the time depicted the president as detached, fiddling with theories, while the nation starved. Though unfair in some respects, Hoover worked tirelessly behind the scenes. His reluctance to provide direct aid created the image of a leader, aloof to suffering still. Hoover did act. In 1932, he established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, a government agency empowered to lend money to banks, railroads, and other key industries. The logic was sound. Stabilize the institutions at the heart of the economy, and recovery would filter outward. Yet to ordinary Americans, these loans to corporations looked like favoritism. Why, they asked, could Washington find millions for banks, but not for hungry families? Shantytowns that spread across the country came to be derisively called Hoovervilles, their name a bitter reminder of the president's perceived failures. Men wrapped themselves in newspapers for warmth and called them Hoover blankets. Empty pockets turned inside out were called Hoover flags. Language itself became a protest. Hoover's political instincts only deepened the divide. When desperate veterans of the First World War marched on Washington in 1932, demanding early payment of promised bonuses, the government's response was harsh. Troops under General Douglas MacArthur used tear gas and bayonets to disperse the so-called bonus army, burning their camps to the ground. Images of veterans men who had once worn the nation's uniform fleeing from government soldiers shocked the public. For many, it was the final blow to Hoover's credibility, sealing his fate in the upcoming election. Historians like David Kennedy and William Leuchtenberg note that Hoover was not heartless, but trapped by his convictions. He feared that direct federal relief would create dependency and undermine the nation's character. He believed that recovery had to come from the top down, through the revival of business confidence. Yet, as the Depression deepened, it became clear that confidence could not be commanded, and that the suffering of millions required a new kind of leadership. For Americans, in 1931 and 1932, the sense of abandonment was palpable. Newspapers carried stories of families evicted from their homes, of children fainting from hunger in classrooms, of suicides born of despair. Churches and local charities did what they could, but their resources were dwarfed by the scale of need. Each week brought new bank failures, new layoffs, new despair. The optimism of the Roaring Twenties seemed not just distant, but delusional. A cruel memory, mocked by the silence of shuttered factories and the emptiness of dinner tables. Looking back from 2025, the lesson feels familiar. Leaders who speak of resilience and faith may sound reassuring in normal times. But in moments of profound crisis, people need more than words. They need tangible relief, visible action, and reassurance that their government will stand beside them. When banks faltered in our own time, swift interventions and direct support were necessary to prevent panic. Hoover's era, by contrast, revealed the cost of hesitation and ideology when urgency demanded pragmatism. By the summer of 1932, as the presidential campaign gathered momentum, America was ready for change. Hoover, worn by the weight of failure and vilified by those he tried to help indirectly, stood as a symbol of outdated methods. The nation yearned for a new vision, a leader who would not just preach confidence, but deliver hope in tangible form. The stage was set for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose voice would soon echo across the airwaves with promises of a New Deal. By 1932, the mood of America had curdled from anxious patience to raw despair. The breadlines stretched longer, the shantytowns multiplied, and the unemployment rate swelled to nearly a quarter of the nation's workforce. Families who had once lived modest but stable lives now found themselves clutching scraps, while newspapers reported with grim monotony the latest bank collapse or wave of layoffs. Herbert Hoover's voice, once steady with assurance, now sounded brittle, as though each optimistic phrase cracked under the weight of reality. The country was not merely in crisis, it was hungry for transformation, for someone to lift their gaze from dust and despair toward the possibility of renewal. It was in this moment that Franklin Delano Roosevelt rose to the stage, born into privilege, struck by polio in 1921, and tempered by struggle. Roosevelt carried both the confidence of aristocracy and the resilience of one who had known physical suffering. His illness, which left him paralyzed from the waist down, could have ended his career. Instead, it became the crucible that shaped his empathy, teaching him the language of endurance and the necessity of adaptation. When Roosevelt campaigned for the presidency in 1932, his voice rang with a mixture of optimism and resolve that millions found irresistible. On the campaign trail, he promised not easy answers, but a new deal for the American people. The phrase was deliberately vague, but it carried the weight of possibility. Where Hoover had insisted that government must not intrude too deeply, Roosevelt signaled that government could and must act boldly to rescue its citizens. His speeches, delivered with calm assurance, painted a vision of collective effort. The nation would not stand by idly while its people starved, but would marshal its resources to rebuild and restore. Roosevelt's charisma was matched by his mastery of communication. In a time when radio had become the hearth of American households, he understood the intimacy of the medium. Unlike Hoover, who often spoke in stiff, technical terms, Roosevelt's words flowed like conversation. He spoke not to crowds but to families, as though he were seated beside them in their living rooms. His voice carried warmth, humor, and confidence, qualities that felt like balm to a wounded public. It was not merely what he promised, but how. He made people feel that they were seen, heard, and not alone. The election of 1932 was a landslide. Roosevelt carried 42 of 48 states, a resounding rejection of Hoover and the philosophy of inaction. On Inauguration Day, in March 1933, Roosevelt delivered a line that would become immortal. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." The phrase distilled the paralysis of the Depression into a single enemy fear and promised that courage and unity could overcome it. In that moment, many Americans felt a spark of hope ignite, fragile yet real, after years of darkness. Historians, like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., later argued that Roosevelt's genius was not only in policy but in psychology. He understood that leadership during crisis required more than programs. It required restoring faith. His willingness to experiment, try one solution, and if it failed, to try another stood in sharp contrast to Hoover's rigid adherence to principle. Roosevelt told the people that action was coming, and then he delivered, closing banks temporarily to restore order, creating jobs through public works, and establishing programs to protect depositors and farmers. Each move was imperfect, but each signaled movement, and in movement lay reassurance. For ordinary Americans, Roosevelt became more than a politician. It was a symbol of possibility. Families huddled around radios to hear his fireside chats, finding comfort in his steady tone. Farmers saw in him a chance that Washington might finally understand their plight. Workers believed he would fight to restore their dignity. Even children, sensing their parents' relief, grew up with the memory of a president whose voice carried through the static like a promise that tomorrow might not be as bleak as today. Looking from 2025, the arrival of Roosevelt feels like a reminder of what leadership can mean in times of profound uncertainty. Today, when markets falter or crises loom, we look to policymakers not only for technical fixes, but for reassurance that someone holds the wheel. The ghost of 1929 whispers that numbers alone cannot save a nation. What matters equally is trust, belief, and the courage to act boldly when fear threatens to paralyze. As Roosevelt took his first steps into office, the Depression was far from over. The banks were still tottering, the unemployed still desperate, and the economy still in freefall. But for the first time in years, the nation felt that someone had grasped the urgency of the hour. The people had chosen not just a president, but a storyteller of hope, one who would redefine the role of government and chart a path through the storm. The New Deal had yet to be written, but its promise already glowed in the hearts of millions, like the first flicker of dawn on the horizon of a long night. When Franklin Roosevelt took the oath of office on that brisk March day in 1933, the nation stood at the edge of collapse. Banks were failing in a rolling wave across the country. In some states, governors had declared bank holidays to prevent panicked withdrawals from draining vaults dry. Unemployment hovered around 25%, and the hum of factories had been replaced by silence. Into this void, Roosevelt strode, not with timidity, but with urgency, declaring in his inaugural address that this was a day of national consecration and promising bold action. If Hoover had embodied hesitation, Roosevelt embodied momentum. Within hours of taking office, he declared a nationwide bank holiday, closing every bank in the country to stem the panic. To a public battered by years of broken promises, this bold step might have deepened fear, but Roosevelt coupled it with an extraordinary act of communication. In his first fireside chat, he explained calmly, in plain language, why the banks were closing, how they would be examined, and when they would reopen. He spoke not as a distant bureaucrat, but as a neighbor across the hearth, asking for trust, and remarkably, the trust was given. When banks reopened days later, Americans lined up not to withdraw, but to deposit their savings, a reversal that astonished even seasoned observers. Confidence, fragile as it was, had been rekindled. The momentum continued. In those first 100 days, Roosevelt and Congress unleashed a torrent of legislation that reshaped the federal government's role in daily life. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, put young men to work planting trees, building trails, and restoring the land tens of thousands of jobs born almost overnight. The Agricultural Adjustment Act sought to stabilize crop prices by reducing surpluses, offering farmers hope that their toil might once again bring dignity instead of ruin. The Tennessee Valley Authority brought electricity and infrastructure to impoverished regions, a reminder that progress was not confined to cities, but could reach the most forgotten hollows. Equally transformative was the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, which guaranteed bank deposits. For the first time, Ordinary Americans could place their savings in a bank without fearing that a sudden collapse would erase their security. It was a profound shift. Faith in the financial system, so badly damaged, was being restored, not by slogans but by law. The Securities Act began to regulate the stock market, promising transparency after years of reckless speculation, piece by piece. Roosevelt was building guardrails where before there had been none. The impact on ordinary Americans was immediate and emotional. Letters poured into the White House, many written in shaky handwriting on scraps of paper, thanking the president for restoring hope. "You have saved my home," one farmer wrote, after relief funds prevented foreclosure. "You have given me work," a young man reported from a CCC camp, where he earned a small wage and sent most of it back to his family. Even though still struggling, felt a shift in the air, the sense that Washington had not abandoned them. That government could be a partner in survival, rather than a distant overseer. Of course, not everyone approved. Critics on the right warned that Roosevelt's actions bordered on socialism, accusing him of undermining free enterprise. Some business leaders bristled at regulations, while fiscal conservatives balked at the explosion of government spending. Yet for millions of ordinary citizens, these objections mattered little. What mattered was the return of a paycheck, the reopening of a bank, the sight of neighbors working again instead of standing idle. Roosevelt's genius was in balancing urgency with reassurance, combining sweeping action with words that soothed and inspired. Historians later dubbed this period the first 100 days, a benchmark by which future presidents would be measured. But at the time, it was simply a whirlwind of change, a break from paralysis. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. described it as the greatest surge of legislative energy in American history. To the people who lived it, it was something more intimate, a turning of the tide. For the first time in years, they could imagine not just enduring, but rebuilding. From the vantage point of 2025, Roosevelt's first 100 days carry lessons that feel as urgent as ever. In moments of crisis, whether financial collapse, pandemic, or geopolitical shock, speed matters. So does communication. Roosevelt's ability to look into a microphone and convince millions that their deposits were safe was as powerful as any law he passed. Today, leaders still grapple with the challenge of explaining complex policies in ways that restore faith. The ghost of 1929 whispers that action without trust is fragile, and trust without action is hollow. Roosevelt, in those 100 days, managed to bind the two together. As spring turned to summer in 1933, America was far from healed. The Depression still raged, unemployment still scarred communities, and hunger still haunted many homes. But there was movement, and in movement there was hope. Families who had once whispered despair at the dinner table now spoke cautiously of tomorrow. The light was faint, but it was visible, flickering at the edge of a long night. Roosevelt had not solved the Depression, but he had given the nation something just as precious: the belief that solutions were possible. The flurry of laws and programs that poured out of Washington in Roosevelt's first 100 days electrified the nation. For millions of ordinary Americans, it was as though the government had finally stepped down from the marble steps of the Capitol and walked into their kitchens, farms, and factories. A young man earning wages through the Civilian Conservation Corps, a farmer receiving payments to keep his land afloat, a family reassured that their savings were safe in a bank insured by the FDIC, felt the presence of Washington in ways they never had before. For them, the New Deal was not an abstraction, but bread on the table. Dignity restored, hope rekindled. Yet for others, this bold expansion of federal power was alarming, even threatening. Business leaders grumbled that Roosevelt was tampering with the natural rhythms of the market, that his regulations and reforms would choke enterprise and innovation. Conservative newspapers railed against the dictatorship of the New Deal, warning that the president's sweeping authority was steering the nation toward socialism. The Chamber of Commerce and other organizations lobbied furiously against what they saw as government intrusion, painting Roosevelt not as a savior but as a reckless experimenter gambling with the nation's future. The courts, too, quickly became a battleground. Some of the early New Deal measures, particularly those aimed at regulating industry and agriculture, faced legal challenges almost as soon as they were enacted. Judges steeped in decades of laissez-faire tradition were skeptical of this sudden surge of federal power. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, which paid farmers to cut production in order to stabilize prices, struck many as unconstitutional meddling. The National Industrial Recovery Act, designed to regulate wages and working conditions across industries, faced fierce scrutiny as an overreach. Though Roosevelt's reforms often sprang from pragmatism rather than ideology, the opposition framed them as radical departures from American tradition. And yet, the president seemed undeterred. He wore the criticism almost like armor, understanding that opposition was the price of action. His fireside chats reminded Americans that the New Deal was not a philosophy but a lifeline, an experiment in survival. Bold, persistent experimentation, he declared, was the only way forward. Try something, and if it failed, try something else. In that simple creed, Roosevelt captured both the desperation and the determination of the moment, for families who had been waiting years for Washington to act. This willingness to try was itself a form of salvation. Public opinion bore out this divide. Polls and letters to the White House revealed overwhelming support among ordinary citizens, who viewed Roosevelt as a friend in high office. They wrote of tears shed during his radio addresses, of children cheering when paychecks returned to the household, of neighbors whispering his name with gratitude. But in boardrooms and editorial pages, hostility festered. Some industrialists openly plotted to challenge the New Deal in courts and in Congress, warning that if unchecked, Roosevelt's policies would destroy capitalism itself. The irony, of course, was that without intervention, capitalism had already teetered on the brink of collapse. Historians like William Leuchtenberg have noted that the genius of the New Deal was not in solving the Depression. Overnight it did, not but in reshaping the relationship between government and citizen. For the first time, the federal government assumed responsibility for the economic well-being of individuals, a responsibility it would never fully relinquish. This transformation was unsettling to those invested in the old order, but to the hungry and the desperate, it was nothing short of revolutionary. From our vantage point in 2025, the echoes are unmistakable. Whenever modern governments roll out sweeping programs, whether stimulus packages during a pandemic, relief funds during recessions, or regulations on powerful industries, the same chorus arises. On one side, gratitude from those who feel rescued. On the other, suspicion from those who fear overreach. The ghost of the New Deal still stalks our debates, a reminder that in times of crisis, bold action will always divide as much as it unites. By the close of Roosevelt's first year, it was clear that the New Deal had changed the national landscape. The Depression was far from conquered, but the country no longer drifted rudderless. Instead, it sailed under a captain willing to try, to risk, and to speak directly to his people. The critics had not been silenced, and the courts would soon strike down some of his boldest measures. But the American people, for the most part, had made their choice. They would walk with Roosevelt into the unknown, carrying with them the fragile but precious belief that tomorrow might, at last, be better than today. By 1934, the first whirlwind of Roosevelt's New Deal had given the country breathing space, but not deliverance. The banks had been stabilized, young men were at work in the Civilian Conservation Corps, and relief checks flowed into homes that had been barren of hope. Yet the Depression still hung heavy. Unemployment remained in the double digits, farms still struggled with low prices, and the specter of hunger had not vanished. Americans were grateful, but they were restless, and Roosevelt knew the first wave of emergency action would not be enough. What the nation needed now was not just survival but reconstruction, a deeper rethinking of how government could shape economic life. The year 1934 became a hinge in the story of the Depression. Roosevelt faced midterm elections, and the verdict was decisive. Democrats expanded their majority in Congress, a sign that the public endorsed his bold experiments. Buoyed by this mandate, Roosevelt prepared what historians would later call the Second New Deal, a shift from immediate relief to structural reform. If the first New Deal had been about stopping the bleeding, the Second New Deal aimed to rebuild the bones. One of the most significant moves came with the creation of the Works Progress Administration (WPA) in 1935. Unlike the CCC, which focused on young men in camps, the WPA cast a far wider net, employing millions of Americans in projects that ranged from building roads and schools to painting murals and writing histories. It was a program not only of labor but of dignity, giving work to artists, writers, and musicians as well as construction workers. The philosophy was simple but radical. In a democracy, even creative work could be recognized as essential labor. Towns across America soon bore the marks of the WPA, bridges, libraries, and public art that remain standing to this day, silent. Testaments to a time when art and infrastructure became tools of recovery. Equally transformative was the passage of the Social Security Act in 1935. For the first time in American history, the federal government established a system of pensions for the elderly, unemployment insurance for the jobless, and aid for dependent children. To a generation that had watched security vanish overnight, Social Security was more than it was a promise. It declared that the nation would not abandon its vulnerable, that old age would not mean destitution, and that misfortune would not strip away every shred of dignity. Critics denounced it as socialism, but for millions it became a cornerstone of trust between citizen and state. The Wagner Act, also known as the National Labor Relations Act, gave workers the legal right to unionize and bargain collectively. For years, labor had been battered by unemployment, wage cuts, and hostile employers. Now the government itself stood as a protector of workers' voices, shifting the balance of power in factories and mills. The sight of workers organizing under the protection of law transformed the American workplace, fueling a wave of union growth that reshaped industry for decades to come. These reforms did not pass without resistance. The Supreme Court struck down several New Deal measures, arguing they exceeded constitutional limits. Conservatives accused Roosevelt of seizing too much power, and wealthy elites whispered about conspiracies to rein in his influence. Yet Roosevelt pressed forward, his resolve hardened by both the depth of the crisis and the overwhelming support of the electorate. In speeches, he sharpened his rhetoric, declaring that the true enemies of recovery were economic royalists, who sought to preserve privilege at the expense of the many. It was a populist tone, and it resonated deeply with a public that had grown weary of deference to the wealthy. For ordinary Americans, the Second New Deal marked a turning point. Relief had been crucial, but reform gave them something more enduring: the sense that the rules of the game were being rewritten in their favor. A farmer could hope for fairer crop prices, a worker could join a union without fear of reprisal, and an elderly parent could dream of a modest pension to carry them through their twilight years. The Depression had not ended, but the future no longer seemed as hopelessly bleak. From our vantage point in 2025, these reforms remain part of the scaffolding of American life. Social Security checks arrive each month. Union protections, though, weakened over time, still exist, and public art and infrastructure from the WPA continue to shape communities. The debates of the 1930s over the role of government, the balance between relief and responsibility, The tension between individualism and collective security are still with us. The ghost of the New Deal is not merely a memory, it is a living inheritance. By the mid-1930s, Roosevelt had transformed not only the machinery of government, but the expectations of the people. No longer would Americans accept a federal government that stood aside in times of crisis. They now looked to Washington not just for protection, but for partnership. It was a profound shift, one that would endure long after the Depression faded, shaping the contours of the modern American state. The sweeping changes of the Second New Deal stirred millions of Americans with hope, but hope for some meant fear for others. As Roosevelt expanded the reach of government into banking, labor, and agriculture, the powerful voices of business and conservative politics rose in alarm. For industrialists and financiers, who had long enjoyed an almost unchallenged hand in shaping the economy, the New Deal appeared not as salvation, but as a creeping revolution. Newspapers sympathetic to business interests ran editorials warning that Roosevelt was dismantling capitalism brick by brick, while whispers of socialism began to swirl in boardrooms and dinner clubs. The fiercest resistance emerged from the Supreme Court, rooted in decades of laissez-faire interpretation. The court struck down some of Roosevelt's most ambitious reforms. In 1935, it declared the National Industrial Recovery Act unconstitutional, arguing that it gave the federal government powers far beyond its scope. The following year, parts of the Agricultural Adjustment Act met a similar fate. To Roosevelt's allies, these rulings felt like sabotage in elected justices clinging to outdated doctrines, while the nation cried out for innovation. To conservatives, the court was a guardian of constitutional limits, a bulwark against a president they feared was too willing to bend the rules. But opposition was not limited to the right. Populist figures on the left also criticized Roosevelt, though for different reasons. Senator Huey Long of Louisiana thundered that the New Deal did not go far enough. With his Share Our Wealth program, Long promised to cap personal fortunes and guarantee every family a basic income, capturing the imagination of millions who felt Roosevelt's reforms left them behind. Father Charles Coughlin, a fiery radio priest, railed against bankers and elites with a mixture of economic critique and dark conspiracy, building a following that rivaled Roosevelt's own radio audience. Francis Townsend, a California doctor, rallied elderly Americans with his proposal for generous pensions, pushing Social Security to evolve more quickly than Roosevelt initially planned. These voices represented not rejection of Roosevelt's boldness, but hunger for even bolder action, proving that in the turbulence of the Depression, no single program could satisfy all. Faced with enemies on the right and critics on the left, Roosevelt displayed his characteristic resilience. He sharpened his rhetoric, portraying his wealthy opponents as economic royalists who resented losing their grip on privilege. In a speech during the 1936 campaign, he declared with relish that he welcomed their hatred, a line that electrified crowds. His mastery lay not only in policy but in framing the struggle as moral as well as economic, a battle between entrenched privilege and ordinary Americans striving for fairness. The backlash, however, was real and potent. Businessmen organized campaigns to undermine New Deal legislation, funding lawsuits and lobbying Congress to halt reforms. Conservative Democrats broke ranks, forming uneasy alliances with Republicans to slow Roosevelt's momentum. The press, once deferential to presidents, launched stinging critiques, painting him as reckless or dictatorial. And in living rooms across America, debates grew heated. Was Roosevelt saving the country or remaking it into something unrecognizable? For millions of ordinary citizens, though, the answer was clear. They might not have understood the intricacies of constitutional law or economic theory, but they understood what a paycheck meant, what a hot meal signified, what dignity returned through work programs felt like. Roosevelt's political genius was his ability to stand in the storm of criticism and continue to communicate directly with the people, bypassing elites who sought to curtail him. His fireside chats kept Americans tethered to his vision, soothing fears even as opponents shouted louder. From our vantage point, in 2025, the battles of the mid-1930s still echo in every debate about the scope of government. Whenever sweeping reforms are proposed, be they healthcare expansions, stimulus programs, or climate initiatives, the same chorus emerges: accusations of overreach, fears of socialism, demands for restraint. At the same time, new populist voices on the fringes push for even more radical measures. The New Deal reminds us that profound change rarely moves unopposed, and that resistance, whether from courts, corporations, or rival ideologies, is not a side note, but part of the very process of transformation. By 1936, Roosevelt's critics had grown louder, but so had his base of support. The Depression was not yet over, but the nation had begun to change in ways that no court ruling or editorial could reverse. The lines were drawn between those who saw the New Deal as salvation and those who saw it as betrayal, between those who feared its reach and those who longed for it to go further. It was not merely a political conflict, but a defining struggle over the meaning of democracy itself in the modern age. The election of 1936 unfolded as a referendum, not only on Franklin Roosevelt, but on the New Deal itself. By then, the Depression had stretched nearly 7 years, and while the economy showed signs of life, hardship was still everywhere. Critics hammered Roosevelt as reckless, dictatorial, and dangerous, charging that he was leading the nation down the road to ruin. Yet for millions of Americans whose lives had been touched by relief checks, work projects, or the assurance of Social Security, Roosevelt represented not danger, but survival. The contest would reveal which vision of America had captured the people's hearts. The Republican Party nominated Kansas Governor Alf Landon, a moderate businessman who accepted some aspects of the New Deal, but argued it had grown bloated and inefficient. Landon campaigned as a practical alternative, promising to maintain popular reforms like Social Security while eliminating what he saw as waste and bureaucracy. He was likable, intelligent, and earnest, but in a time of turmoil, he struggled to project the fire that Roosevelt carried so effortlessly. Roosevelt, meanwhile, barnstormed the country with characteristic confidence, casting the election as a battle between the people and entrenched elites. In city squares and on radio waves, he portrayed his opponents as defenders of privilege, who could not grasp the struggles of ordinary families. The campaign was not gentle. Business leaders funneled money into anti-Roosevelt organizations, warning that the New Deal was leading to socialism or even dictatorship. Pamphlets and posters claimed that Social Security was a sham, that relief programs bred laziness, and that Roosevelt's ambitions knew no bounds. But the president countered with something more powerful: stories. In his speeches and chats, he invoked the farmer who had saved his land through government loans, the worker who had found dignity in WPA projects, the elderly parent who now faced old age with the security of a pension. Against abstract accusations, Roosevelt placed flesh and blood examples, reminding voters that the New Deal was not theory, but their own lives. The results in November stunned even Roosevelt's allies. He won 46 of the 48 states, carrying every region except Maine and Vermont. His share of the popular vote soared above 60%, one of the largest margins in American history. It was not simply a victory. It was a mandate, a roaring endorsement of his vision. Alf Landon, gracious in defeat, admitted that Roosevelt had won the trust of the people, a trust so deep that not even the fiercest criticisms could shake it. The scale of the victory reshaped the political landscape. Democrats dominated Congress with supermajorities, giving Roosevelt unprecedented room to maneuver. For the first time, the federal government stood not as a hesitant actor, but as the central force in American life, empowered by a people who demanded boldness. To his supporters, the election proved that the New Deal was not a temporary experiment, but the new foundation of democracy. To his detractors, it confirmed their fears. Roosevelt was no longer just a president. He was the most powerful man in American history, carrying the weight of a movement larger than himself. Historians like Doris Kearns Goodwin have pointed out that the 1936 landslide was as much emotional as it was political. Roosevelt's gift was not only policy, but empathy. He made people believe he was on their side, that he understood their pain, and that he would fight for them, even against the wealthiest and most powerful. In a time when despair could have curdled into cynicism, he nurtured a sense of belonging and purpose. The forgotten man, once abandoned on Brett Lyons, now had a champion in the White House. Yet Roosevelt's triumph carried seeds of future conflict. With such overwhelming power, he soon tested the limits of his authority, leading to the controversial battle over the Supreme Court in 1937. The very confidence that secured his re-election would soon provoke fears of overreach. For the moment, however, in the glow of victory, the nation embraced him. Crowds cheered, radios buzzed with his voice, and even in the poorest homes, there was a flicker of pride that democracy had spoken so clearly. Looking back from 2025, the 1936 election remains a reminder of the power of trust and leadership. Policy alone does not win such landslides. It is the bond between leader and people, forged in hardship and tested in doubt. Roosevelt did not erase the Depression, but he convinced Americans that they were not alone in facing it, and in politics. That sense of solidarity can be stronger than any argument. Thus, the election of 1936 was more than a victory for Roosevelt. It was a turning point in American history. It confirmed that the nation was willing to embrace a new vision of government, one that would shape the rest of the 20th century. And for millions who had once stared into the abyss of despair, it was proof that their voices still mattered, that democracy could still deliver hope, even in the darkest times. The glow of Roosevelt's landslide victory in 1936 soon gave way to one of the most controversial gambits of his presidency. Flush with confidence, armed with massive congressional majorities, and convinced that the American people stood firmly behind him, Roosevelt turned his gaze to what he saw as the greatest obstacle to his New Deal: the Supreme Court. Since 1935, the court had struck down several key pieces of legislation, including the National Industrial Recovery Act and parts of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, dismantling reforms Roosevelt believed essential to recovery. To him, these rulings were not mere legal disputes, but acts of sabotage by 9 unelected men clinging to outdated doctrines while the nation cried out for progress. By early 1937, Roosevelt resolved to act. In February, he unveiled a proposal that shocked Washington. For every justice over the age of 70 who did not retire, the president could appoint an additional justice, up to 6 more. In theory, the plan was framed as a way to relieve the burden on aging judges. In reality, everyone understood it for what it was: a bid to tilt the balance of the court in Roosevelt's favor, ensuring that his New Deal programs would survive constitutional challenge. Supporters called it a pragmatic necessity. Opponents called it a power grab. The press quickly gave it a name that would stick: the court-packing plan. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Even many of Roosevelt's allies in Congress balked at the audacity of the scheme. Critics argued that tampering with the structure of the Supreme Court threatened the very foundation of American democracy. Editorials warned that if Roosevelt succeeded, no future president would be restrained from reshaping the judiciary to suit his political will. The accusation of dictatorship, once the cry of his most extreme opponents, now echoed from more moderate voices. For the first time in his presidency, Roosevelt faced a rebellion not just from conservatives, but from within his own party. The debate consumed Washington through the spring and summer of 1937. Roosevelt toured the country defending his plan, insisting that the court had become an obstacle to the will of the people. But the backlash only grew. The Senate Judiciary Committee issued a blistering report condemning the proposal as an invasion of judicial power, such as has never before been attempted in this country. Senators who had cheered Roosevelt's reforms only months earlier now distanced themselves, unwilling to be seen as accomplices in undermining the court. Ironically, even as Roosevelt fought this battle, the court itself began to shift, in what became known as the switch in time that saved 9. Justice Owen Roberts surprised observers by siding with liberal colleagues to uphold key New Deal legislation, including a Washington state minimum wage law. The timing was uncanny. Just as Roosevelt sought to add justices, the court seemed to soften its resistance. Whether Roberts' change was prompted by political pressure or genuine evolution of thought remains debated, but the effect was clear. The court was no longer a monolithic obstacle. By July, Roosevelt's plan lay in ruins. Congress, even with its overwhelming Democratic majorities, refused to pass the measure. The president, who had won one of the greatest electoral victories in history, now suffered one of his most humiliating defeats. The episode left scars. His aura of invincibility was punctured. His relationships with Congress frayed, and his critics emboldened, though he would go on to win important legislative victories later. The court-packing fight marked the moment when Roosevelt's power met its limits. Historians often view this episode as a paradox. On the one hand, the plan was a political disaster, costing Roosevelt precious goodwill. On the other, it arguably achieved its aim without passing. The court, chastened or coincidentally evolving, began to uphold New Deal legislation thereafter. Social Security, labor protections, and regulatory laws survived and became entrenched. Not by changing the court's structure, but by changing its decisions. Roosevelt lost the battle but won the war, leaving the New Deal intact for generations. For Americans in 1937, the controversy was unsettling. Many had trusted Roosevelt implicitly, but now they questioned whether his hunger for reform might overreach. Town hall meetings buzzed with debates about whether the president had saved democracy or endangered it. Even ordinary citizens, who had benefited from jobs and relief, worried about tampering with the balance of power. Democracy, after all, is not only about results, but about rules. And the court-packing plan tested those rules to their breaking point. From our vantage point, in 2025, the court-packing crisis still resonates. Debates over the size and power of the Supreme Court flare whenever rulings divide the nation, and proposals to expand or reform the judiciary continue to spark fierce arguments. Roosevelt's experience serves as both a cautionary tale and a reminder. Even leaders with overwhelming support cannot bend institutions without consequence. The ghost of 1937 whispers that in a democracy, the boundaries of power are as important as the goals pursued. By the close of the year, Roosevelt's New Deal still stood, but his political capital was diminished. The Depression remained international. Tensions were rising, and the limits of reform were laid bare. The court-packing episode had revealed not only the fragility of institutions, but the dangers of overconfidence, even for a leader as gifted as Roosevelt. Yet despite the defeat, the broader legacy of the New Deal endured proof that sometimes the measure of leadership is not in the battles won, but in the structures that survive. The year 1937 began with Roosevelt, still buoyed by his sweeping re-election, but beneath the surface, the economy was beginning to tremble again. After years of steady, if uneven, recovery, industrial production slowed, unemployment ticked upward, and consumer confidence faltered. For millions of Americans who had begun to believe that the worst was behind them, The sudden downturn was a bitter shock. They had endured years of hunger and hardship, placed their trust in the New Deal, and now feared the nightmare was returning. Historians would later call it the Roosevelt Recession, a cruel twist that threatened to unravel the progress made since 1933. The causes were complex. Part of the decline stemmed from Roosevelt's own policies. Concerned about mounting deficits, his administration cut federal spending in 1937, scaling back relief programs and public works. At the same time, new Social Security, payroll taxes, took effect, reducing workers' take-home pay, just as businesses were struggling to expand. The combination of reduced government stimulus and higher payroll costs drained momentum from the fragile recovery. The Federal Reserve, worried about inflation, tightened monetary policy, further chilling the economy. The result was a contraction, sharper than many expected, a sudden chill after years of cautious hope. The numbers were grim. By late 1937, unemployment had surged back to nearly 20%, wiping out gains of the previous years. Industrial output fell by a third, and the stock market tumbled once again, erasing much of the rebound that had followed the darkest days of 1932, 1933. Factories that had roared back to life now fell silent. Their doors shuttered, their workers once again cast into the uncertainty of joblessness. For ordinary Americans, the sense of betrayal was palpable. Had the promise of recovery been an illusion? Critics pounced. Conservatives argued that the New Deal had failed, that government interference had distorted natural recovery, and that Roosevelt's reckless experiments had doomed the economy to perpetual instability. Business leaders renewed their attacks, warning that confidence could never return under a president so eager to regulate and tax. Meanwhile, voices on the left accused Roosevelt of retreating too soon, of allowing fear of deficits to outweigh the needs of the people. They argued that the recession proved the necessity of even more government spending, not less. Roosevelt, caught between these camps, faced one of the most difficult political moments of his presidency. The president responded with characteristic boldness. By 1938, he reversed course, pushing Congress to approve new spending programs, reviving public works, and expanding relief. Billions flowed once again into the economy, and slowly the slide was arrested. Yet the damage to Roosevelt's political momentum was real. The optimism that had fueled the New Deal now carried an edge of doubt, and the court-packing debacle of the previous year still lingered in memory. For the first time since 1933, Roosevelt seemed less invincible, more vulnerable to criticism, more constrained by political realities. The Roosevelt recession revealed a deeper truth about the Depression itself. It was not a single crisis, to be solved, but a long, grinding ordeal that defied quick fixes. Relief programs could ease suffering, reforms could reshape institutions, but full recovery remained elusive. The underlying wounds of the global economy, the collapse of trade, the instability of currencies, the scars of war were beyond the reach of even the boldest domestic policies. It would take another kind of storm, the mobilization for World War II, to finally lift America out of depression entirely. Still, the episode carried lessons that resonate into 2025 governments. Then, as now, walk a tightrope between stimulating growth and managing debt, between bold spending and fiscal restraint. In 1937, Roosevelt leaned toward caution, and the result was a painful relapse. Today, debates over deficits, interest rates, and the timing of stimulus echoed the same dilemma. Act too timidly and risk stagnation. Act too aggressively and risk instability. The ghost of 1937 hovers over every modern policymaker who wonders when to press forward and when to pull back. For the people living through it, however, the lesson was simpler and starker. Families who had found work in WPA projects or relief, through New Deal checks, saw that lifeline vanish too soon. Workers who had tasted hope found themselves again in breadlines. Farmers who had begun to climb from debt slipped back toward foreclosure. Trust in government, carefully rebuilt since 1933, wavered once more. Roosevelt remained personally popular, his charisma and empathy still powerful. But the aura of unstoppable progress was gone by the end of the decade. America stood in a peculiar balance, stronger than in the depths of 1932, yet still fragile, still vulnerable to shocks, still searching for a path to lasting recovery. The New Deal had altered the relationship between people and government forever, but it had not conquered the Depression. The Roosevelt recession was a reminder that history rarely moves in straight lines, and that even bold leaders stumble when confronting storms as vast as those of the 1930s. By the late 1930s, the United States found itself at a crossroads. The trauma of the Depression still lingered, its wounds visible in the shuttered factories of the Midwest and the hollow-eyed families of rural America. Yet beyond the Atlantic, darker storms were gathering. Adolf Hitler had consolidated power in Germany, Benito Mussolini marched his armies across Africa, and civil war raged in Spain as fascism and democracy clashed on the battlefields of Europe. To Americans still struggling at home, these distant crises felt at once irrelevant and terrifying. Why, they asked, should a nation still haunted by breadlines involve itself in foreign quarrels? But Roosevelt, watching carefully, understood that the fate of America's economy and security could not be separated from the fate of the wider world. Isolationism was the dominant mood. Memories of World War I were raw, its promises of a war to end all wars, now mocked by the rise of new dictatorships. Polls showed overwhelming majorities of Americans opposed to involvement in European conflicts. Congress passed a series of neutrality acts designed to keep the United States out of entanglements abroad by restricting arms sales and loans to belligerents. The message was clear. America would tend to its own wounds, leave Europe to its madness, and avoid the mistakes of the past. Yet Roosevelt quietly resisted this tide, though careful not to provoke public backlash. He began to take cautious steps toward preparing the nation for a world that looked increasingly dangerous. Economic recovery at home was still incomplete, and Roosevelt saw an opportunity in defense spending. Military contracts for ships, planes, and munitions could put men back to work, revive factories, and inject life into sluggish industries. In speeches, he framed rearmament not as warmongering, but as insurance against aggression abroad and against despair at home. Slowly, defense spending began to rise, weaving together the threads of economic policy and foreign strategy at the same time. Roosevelt relied on his remarkable skill as a communicator. In fireside chats, he spoke not of distant dictators, but of values freedom, democracy, and the need to remain vigilant. He did not demand intervention, for he knew the people were not ready. Instead, he planted seeds, suggesting that America's fate was linked to that of others, that oceans were not walls against tyranny, and that a strong America must be prepared not only to endure, but to defend. Events abroad soon pressed harder. In 1936, Germany remilitarized the Rhineland. In 1937, Japan escalated its war in China. In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria and then dismembered Czechoslovakia. Each move sent ripples across the globe, and each time Americans debated whether it mattered. Roosevelt walked a tightrope, condemning aggression in principle while avoiding commitments in practice. But behind the scenes, he expanded naval construction, improved the readiness of the army, and forged quiet ties with Britain and France. He was not yet leading the nation into war, but he was steering it away from the illusion that peace could be preserved by wishful thinking alone. For ordinary Americans, these international tremors were experienced through newspapers and radio. broadcasts that mingled foreign names with domestic concerns. A farmer in Kansas might read of German troops in Prague while worrying about crop prices. A factory worker in Detroit might hear news of Japanese bombing in China while wondering whether his job would survive another downturn. The Depression had made Americans inward-looking, and Roosevelt knew he could not ask them to sacrifice for foreign causes when they had sacrificed so much already. His genius lay in gradualism, preparing without proclaiming, nudging without forcing, shaping expectations without shattering them. Historians later observed that this period marked the subtle beginning of America's emergence as a global power. The Depression had taught the dangers of economic collapse. The rise of fascism showed the dangers of global instability. Roosevelt, perhaps more than any leader of his generation, grasped that the two were connected. A world sliding into war would threaten America's fragile recovery, while a strong America could anchor both prosperity and security. His challenge was to prepare the nation for this reality without losing the trust of a people weary of promises and wary of conflict. From the perspective of 2025, the resonance is clear. Just as Roosevelt faced a tension between domestic healing and global responsibility, so too does modern America navigate the balance between internal struggles, debt, inequality, political conflict, and external challenges from abroad. The lesson of the late 1930s is that retreat and denial are temporary comforts, but preparation and resilience are lasting shields. The ghost of Roosevelt's cautious steps reminds us that leadership sometimes means guiding a reluctant people toward truths they are not yet ready to face. As 1939 approached, with Europe edging closer to catastrophe, the United States remained officially neutral, its people clinging to the hope that distance would shield them. But Roosevelt knew that oceans were shrinking, not expanding. In a world of airplanes and ideologies, the Depression had not yet fully ended, but another storm loomed on the horizon, one that would draw America out of its isolation and into the most titanic struggle of the 20th century. On September 1st, 1939, the illusion of peace shattered with the thunder of German tanks rolling into Poland. Within days, Britain and France declared war, and the world that had been teetering on the brink for years finally plunged into open conflict. Across the Atlantic, Americans listened in stunned silence to radio broadcasts describing blitzkrieg lightning, war as Polish cities crumbled under the weight of German bombs. The newspapers carried photographs of refugees, columns of civilians fleeing burning towns, and grim maps showing Hitler's forces slicing through Europe. It was clear that a new war had begun, yet in the United States, the question was immediate and deeply divisive. What would America do? The overwhelming answer from the public was simple: stay out. Memories of the First World War were still raw. Many believed that the sacrifices of 1917 to 1918 had been wasted, that the promises of a lasting peace had dissolved into betrayal and depression. Congress remained firmly isolationist, reinforcing the neutrality acts that prohibited arms sales and loans to warring nations. Polls showed that while Americans sympathized with Britain and France, they were determined not to send their sons to fight in another European war. Across small towns and big cities, the sentiment was the same. America had its own struggles: unemployment, lingering poverty, political divisions, and should not spill blood for quarrels abroad. Roosevelt understood this mood, but he also understood the stakes. He had watched with alarm as fascism spread unchecked, and he knew that if Britain and France fell, America would stand alone in a world dominated by dictatorships. Yet he could not afford to move faster than the people would allow. So he took a cautious path, balancing the nation's desire for neutrality with his own conviction that preparation was essential. Publicly, he promised to keep America out of foreign wars. Privately, he began to explore ways to aid those resisting aggression. The first step came in 1939, when Congress revised the Neutrality acts to allow cash and carry sales of arms and supplies to belligerents. Under this system, Britain and France could purchase American weapons and goods, provided they paid in cash and transported the materials themselves. The measure was framed not as intervention, but as commerce. Yet, it marked a quiet but significant shift. America was no longer a passive bystander. It was beginning to tilt toward those fighting Hitler. For ordinary Americans, the outbreak of war was experienced in a strange duality. On one hand, life went on. Baseball games filled the summer air, factories continued to hum with WPA projects, and families gathered around radios for comedy shows and swing music. On the other hand, the war was ever present in the headlines and in the gnawing awareness that the world beyond America's shores was collapsing. A farmer in Nebraska might worry about crop prices, but also glance uneasily at reports of you prowling the Atlantic. A teacher in New York might lecture on Shakespeare, while students whispered about gas masks and air raids in London. The war was far away, yet uncomfortably close. Roosevelt's fireside chats once again played a crucial role. In calm tones, he reminded the nation of its values: democracy, freedom, and the duty to defend them. He reassured Americans that he would not drag them into war, while subtly urging them to see that neutrality did not mean indifference. Even a neutral, he declared, cannot be neutral between right and wrong. It was a careful dance, designed to shift public opinion inch by inch, preparing minds for the possibility that isolation might not be sustainable. Meanwhile, the economy began to stir under the demands of war production abroad. Orders from Britain and France for planes, ships, and munitions poured into American factories, reviving industries that had languished since the Depression. Workers who had once stood in bread lines now found themselves back at assembly lines, their paychecks feeding families and restoring dignity. The irony was not lost on Roosevelt. The same forces of destruction tearing Europe apart were breathing life into America's economy. War, even before America entered it, was pulling the nation out of depression. Still, tension simmered. Peace groups rallied against involvement, warning that Roosevelt was leading the country into another bloodbath. The America First Committee, which would soon become a powerful voice, began to gather momentum, insisting that the nation's only duty was to defend its own shores. At the same time, those with family ties to Europe, immigrants from Poland, Italy, Germany, or Britain watched with anguish, torn between loyalty to their new homeland and grief. For the old dot from our vantage point in 2025, the fall of 1939 reveals a familiar dilemma: how to balance domestic needs with global responsibility. Just as Roosevelt tiptoed between neutrality and preparation, modern leaders wrestle with how much to intervene in crises abroad while addressing challenges at home. The lesson is that isolation may feel comforting in the short term, but in an interconnected world, distance offers little true safety. The oceans that once seemed wide enough to protect America were already shrinking in the age of bombers and submarines, as autumn turned to winter. Roosevelt knew the storm would only grow darker. Hitler had crushed Poland in weeks, and now his gaze turned westward. France and Britain braced for assault, while America stood on the sidelines, watching, waiting, hoping that neutrality could last. But in the White House, Roosevelt had no illusions. The day was coming when America would be forced to choose, not between war and peace, but between standing alone in a world of tyranny or standing with others in defense of freedom. The summer of 1940 brought a shock so profound that it rippled across every American kitchen table. For months, Americans had followed the strange phony war in Europe, Britain, and France, technically at war with Germany. Yet little fighting visible beyond scattered skirmishes. Many believed that perhaps the worst would be avoided, that a stalemate might hold. Then, in May, Hitler's armies erupted across the Low Countries, bypassing the Maginot Line. and within 6 weeks, the unthinkable had happened. France, proud and mighty, collapsed under the blitzkrieg. By June, German troops marched through Paris, swastikas draped across the city's monuments. Two Americans, who had once trusted that Europe's great democracies would hold the line, the sight was chilling. If France could fall so quickly, what hope was there for Britain standing alone? Newspapers in New York and Chicago ran bold headlines: Paris falls, France capitulates. Radio broadcasts carried the voices of stunned correspondents describing German tanks on the Champs-Élysées. The news was not just about geography, it was about vulnerability. Many Americans suddenly realized that oceans no longer guaranteed safety. The same Luftwaffe planes that had pounded Warsaw and Paris could one day reach across the Atlantic, or so it seemed in the fevered imagination of the time. The collapse of France jolted public opinion like nothing before, shaking the confidence of even the staunchest isolationists. Roosevelt seized the moment. While careful not to promise direct intervention, he framed the crisis as a warning. If Britain fell, he argued, America would stand alone in a world dominated by fascist powers. Neutrality, once seen as prudence, now looked like peril. In speeches, he urged the nation to prepare, calling for unprecedented increases in defense spending. Factories were enlisted to produce planes and ships on a scale never before attempted. In Detroit, the hum of assembly lines that had once built automobiles began to shift toward bombers and tanks. Roosevelt's words echoed through Congress. America must become the arsenal of democracy. The scale of mobilization was staggering. Billions were allocated for new battleships, aircraft carriers, and thousands of warplanes. The Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 introduced the first peacetime draft in American history, requiring young men to register for military service. It was a bold step, one that signaled Roosevelt's recognition that war might be inevitable. Though many Americans grumbled, the mood had shifted enough that the draft passed with broad support. Mothers watched sons line up at draft boards. Fathers remembered their own service in the Great War. And families quietly wondered whether history was about to repeat itself. Still, resistance remained. The America First Committee, led by prominent figures like Charles Lindbergh, argued that Roosevelt was dragging the country toward war against the will of the people. At rallies, speakers thundered that America should focus on defending its own shores, not propping up collapsing European empires. Lindbergh himself warned that aiding Britain would only entangle the United States in another catastrophe. His voice carried weight, especially in the Midwest, where skepticism of Roosevelt's policies ran deep. Yet as German bombers darkened London's skies in the Blitz, sympathy for Britain grew stronger with each passing week. Roosevelt's balancing act grew more delicate. He had to prepare the nation without pushing it faster than it was willing to go. In his fireside chats, he spoke of courage, of values, of the need to help Britain hold the line. He painted aid, not as intervention, but as defense, insisting that America's safety depended on preventing Hitler from dominating Europe. Quietly, he expanded the flow of arms and supplies across the Atlantic, stretching the limits of neutrality laws to keep Britain armed. It was a gamble, but one he judged essential for ordinary Americans. The fall of France transformed daily conversations. Housewives who once clipped coupons now clipped newspaper articles about German advances. Children heard air raid drills in schools, practicing for attacks that might never come but felt frighteningly possible. Workers who had long struggled with unemployment now found themselves courted by booming defense industries, their skills suddenly valuable again. The Depression had not yet ended, but war orders were pulling the nation out of stagnation. The strange irony was that global disaster was breathing life into the American economy. From our vantage point in 2025, the summer of 1940 feels like a hinge of history. It was the moment when America's long insistence on isolation cracked under the weight of reality. The oceans could no longer insulate the nation from danger. The collapse of France proved that tyranny could advance with terrifying speed. Roosevelt's foresight, his willingness to prepare, even against resistance, set the stage for America's eventual role as a global leader. The ghost of that year whispers that denial may feel safe, but in the end, preparation is the truest form of protection. By the autumn of 1940, as Britain stood battered but unbroken under the onslaught of the Luftwaffe, Roosevelt had nudged America closer to engagement than ever before. The arsenal of democracy was being forged, and though the nation still clung to neutrality, the path forward was becoming clear. War had not yet come to American shores, but the footsteps of destiny were, echoing louder with each passing month. The autumn of 1940 brought with it a political drama unlike any America had ever seen. For nearly a century and a half, the precedent set by George Washington had guided the Republic. No president should serve more than 2 terms. The unwritten rule had hardened into tradition, respected by Democrats and Republicans alike, a safeguard against monarchy in all but name. Yet as Europe burned, Roosevelt faced a decision that seemed to defy both history and custom. With Britain standing alone against Hitler, with the outcome of the war uncertain, and with America itself still fragile in its recovery, could he step aside? Or was continuity of leadership itself a form of national defense? Public speculation swirled for months. Some believed Roosevelt would honor tradition, that he would retire with dignity and leave the field to a successor. Others whispered that he had no intention of giving up power, that the temptations of authority were too strong. Roosevelt, ever the master of timing, kept his silence until the summer, allowing anticipation to build. When at last he agreed to accept the Democratic nomination, he framed it not as ambition but as duty. "You are looking at a man," he told delegates, "who has no desire to continue in public life, except as it may serve the best interests of the nation." It was not personal, he insisted. It was necessity. The crowd roared its approval, and history bent under the weight of crisis. The Republicans, sensing opportunity, nominated Wendell Willkie, a businessman with a gift for oratory and a reputation for pragmatism. Willkie was no isolationist firebrand. He recognized the threat posed by Hitler and supported aid to Britain. His campaign argued that Roosevelt had amassed too much power, that a 3rd term threatened the balance of democracy, and that fresh leadership was essential. Willkie's charisma and moderation won him respect, and for a time it seemed the election might be close. The American people, wary of depression and wary of war, were uncertain whether continuity or change would best serve them. The campaign unfolded under the shadow of Europe's agony. Each night, radios crackled with news of the Blitz, of London's neighborhoods bombed into rubble, of Churchill's defiant speeches rallying Britain to fight on alone. Roosevelt used these events to underscore his argument. America needed steady hands, experienced leadership, someone who had guided the nation through the worst of the Depression and now must guide it through the gathering storm. He portrayed the election not as a contest of personalities, but as a question of survival. Could the nation afford to gamble on a newcomer when the world itself was collapsing? For ordinary Americans, the campaign was deeply personal. A father, listening to news of the Blitz while rocking his child, might wonder whether Roosevelt's steady voice was the safer choice. A factory worker newly employed in a defense plant might credit Roosevelt with his paycheck and fear disruption if he were replaced. Yet others bristled at the thought of a 3rd term, fearing that democracy itself was endangered by the precedent. Letters to newspapers revealed the divide. Some praised Roosevelt as indispensable. Others warned that he was drifting toward dictatorship. Roosevelt's mastery of communication once again tipped the balance. His fireside chats reassured the Public that he sought no power for its own sake, only the chance to protect America in a dangerous world. His calm, conversational tone contrasted with Wilkie's sharp attacks, giving voters the impression of a man above politics, even as he played its game with consummate skill. On election night in November 1940, the results spoke clearly. Roosevelt won a decisive victory, carrying 38 of 48 states and securing nearly 55% of the popular vote. Wilkie performed respectably, winning more than 22 million votes. But the people had chosen continuity over change. For the first time in American history, a president would serve a third term, breaking tradition in the name of stability. The victory was historic, but it was also sobering. Roosevelt himself admitted that he had inherited a responsibility heavier than any before. The Depression was not yet fully conquered. The nation was still officially at peace, yet war loomed ever closer. By re-electing him, the American people had placed their trust in his hands, believing that his leadership was the surest bulwark against chaos. Historians would later debate whether Roosevelt sought the third term out of genuine necessity or personal ambition. But in 1940, the distinction mattered little. What mattered was that democracy had spoken, and in speaking had chosen continuity in a time of danger. For ordinary citizens, the result brought a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief that the familiar hand remained at the helm, anxiety that even Roosevelt might not be able to keep America out of war forever. From our vantage point in 2025, the election of 1940 stands as a reminder of how crises can reshape norms, rules that seem inviolable. In calm times, bend under the pressure of survival. Roosevelt's third term was not the end of democracy, but a testament to its adaptability. Proof that the people, not tradition alone, determine the course of the republic. Yet the ghost of 1940 lingers still, raising questions about the balance between continuity and change, between stability and precedent, between the demands of the moment and the lessons of history. By the dawn of 1941, the United States still clung officially to neutrality, but the facade was wearing thin. Across the Atlantic, Britain stood bloodied, yet unbowed, enduring nightly air raids that shattered London's neighborhoods and left families huddled in bomb shelters. Winston Churchill's voice crackled over radio waves, defiant and unyielding, but his words carried a desperate undertone. Britain was running out of money, running out of weapons, running out of time. Without help, the island fortress might not hold. Roosevelt, watching closely, knew that if Britain fell, America would face a world where Hitler controlled Europe, Mussolini commanded the Mediterranean, and Japan roamed unchecked in Asia. Neutrality, once a comfort, now looked like suicide. The problem was simple, but stark. Britain could no longer pay for the arms it desperately needed. Cash and carry, the compromise passed in 1939, had served its purpose, but now British coffers were nearly empty. Without credit or assistance, their ability to buy American planes, tanks, and ammunition would collapse. Roosevelt faced a choice: let Britain fight alone and risk its defeat, or find a way to supply weapons without demanding cash. In January 1941, he unveiled his solution, the Lend-Lease Act. The logic was framed in homely terms that ordinary Americans could grasp. If a neighbor's house was on fire, Roosevelt explained, you didn't insist on selling him a hose. You lent it, knowing that if the fire spread, your own house would be next. The analogy resonated. Lend-Lease would allow the president to lend or lease weapons, ships, and supplies to nations whose defense he deemed vital to U.S. security. Payment could come later, in goods, services, or simply trust. In effect, America would become the great arsenal of democracy, supplying the weapons while others did the fighting. Debate in Congress was fierce. Supporters argued that Lend-Lease was essential, that aiding Britain was the only way to keep Hitler from crossing the Atlantic. in spirit if not in fact. Opponents, led by isolationists and the America First Committee, warned that it was a slippery slope to war. If we lend them guns today, critics charged, we will send our sons tomorrow. Charles Lindbergh, still the most famous voice of isolationism, denounced the plan, insisting that America's only duty was to defend its own shores. Yet as the bombs fell on London and the Nazi war machine loomed larger, public opinion began to shift. Polls showed growing sympathy for Britain, and Roosevelt's plain-spoken analogy about hoses, fires, and neighbors helped crystallize support. When Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941, it marked a turning point. For the first time, America openly committed itself to aiding the fight against fascism, not merely with words, but with weapons. Ships laden with supplies began crossing the Atlantic, guarded by U.S. naval patrols that increasingly clashed with German U-boats, airplanes, tanks, trucks, rifles, and food poured out of American factories, transforming the nation's economy into a war machine even before war was declared. Workers who had once despaired in bread lines now labored on assembly lines, their wages reviving communities, their efforts linking American survival with Britain's. The scale was staggering. Billions of dollars worth of equipment flowed overseas, first to Britain, then to China, and later to the Soviet Union after Hitler's invasion of Russia. Roosevelt described America as the arsenal of democracy, and the phrase stuck, capturing both the pride of contribution and the irony that America was fighting a war with weapons long before it fired a shot. For families at home, the evidence was visible: factories running day and night, trains thundering with cargo, shipyards launching vessels into the sea at breathtaking speed. The Depression, which no policy alone had fully conquered, seemed at last to be yielding to the demands of war production. Not everyone was convinced. Critics continued to warn that Roosevelt was dragging America into a conflict the people did not want. In small towns, isolationist rallies drew crowds waving banners that read, "Keep America out of war." Letters poured into newspapers, both praising and condemning the president. Families with memories of sons lost in the trenches of 1918 shuddered at the thought of another generation marching to battle. Yet for many others, the moral clarity of aiding nations fighting for survival outweighed the risks. Neutrality still existed in law, but in spirit America had chosen a side. From our vantage point in 2025, the Lend-Lease Act reveals the delicate art of leadership in crisis. Roosevelt could not declare war outright. Congress and the public would not permit it, but he found a way to act decisively without breaking the nation's fragile consensus. By framing aid as self-defense, by appealing to common sense rather than ideology, he nudged America across the line between isolation and engagement. The ghost of Lend-Lease still lingers in every modern debate about foreign aid, military support, and the fine line between assistance and intervention. By the summer of 1941, Britain was stronger. America's factories were booming, and Roosevelt had stretched the meaning of neutrality almost to breaking. Yet the president knew that events were accelerating, that the line between lending and fighting was vanishing. German submarines prowled ever closer. Japan's ambitions in the Pacific grew sharper. And the question was no longer if America would enter the war, but when. Lend-Lease had bought time, but it had also set the stage for the inevitable. The arsenal of democracy was awake, and soon the democracy itself would be called to arms. On a quiet Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, the illusion that America could remain apart from the world's war was shattered in a storm of fire and steel. The naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, still drowsy with the rhythms of peacetime, awoke to the thunder of Japanese aircraft screaming out of the sky. Within minutes, bombs and torpedoes tore into battleships anchored in the harbor, columns of smoke rising into the clear morning air. Sailors scrambled from their bunks, some rushing. 2 guns, others leaping into oily waters thick with flames. The USS Arizona erupted in a catastrophic explosion, its decks consumed, more than 1,000 men entombed within. The USS Oklahoma capsized, trapping crew below deck. In less than 2 hours, the pride of the Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. More than 2,000 Americans killed, scores of planes destroyed. The nation stunned, news of the attack raced across the continent. Radios interrupted Sunday church services, announcers' voices trembling as they delivered the impossible. Japan had struck American soil. Families huddled around sets in disbelief, struggling to comprehend how a country that had debated neutrality for so long was suddenly the victim of war. Parents wept, children asked frightened questions, and communities gathered in town squares, their ordinary routines dissolved into shock. For years, Americans had argued about whether to join the war. Now the decision had been made for them, and smoke and blood. The following day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress. His words, calm yet searing, carried into every home. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The phrase etched itself into history, capturing the fury and grief of a wounded nation. Roosevelt asked for a declaration of war, and Congress responded with near unanimity. Only one dissenting vote remained, a symbolic gesture lost in the title, Wave of Unity. The United States was now at war with Japan. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on America, and the conflict Roosevelt had long anticipated had arrived in full. For ordinary Americans, the transformation was immediate and profound. Men lined up at recruiting stations, some out of duty, others out of anger, still others simply swept up in the tide of patriotism. Women, too, found new roles opening before them. Factories that once built cars now churned out bombers. And women filled the assembly lines, riveters with scarves tied tight against the roar of machinery. Children collected scrap metal, families planted victory gardens, and ration books became a new kind of currency. The Depression, which had haunted the nation for a decade, was suddenly eclipsed by mobilization. War became both the greatest danger and the greatest engine of economic revival. The attack also shattered illusions about geography and safety. Oceans, once believed to shield America, now seemed perilously narrow. The sense of vulnerability was raw, visible in the blackouts ordered along coastal cities, in the watchful eyes scanning skies for enemy bombers, in the suspicion cast upon Japanese American communities who would soon face the injustice of internment. Fear and anger reshaped daily life, binding Americans together in unity, but also exposing fault lines of prejudice and suspicion. Roosevelt understood the enormity of the moment. In his speeches, he framed the conflict not only as retaliation, but as a defense of civilization itself. He cast America's role as the champion of democracy against tyranny, a theme that resonated across a nation still raw from the Depression, but now galvanized by common purpose. Factories roared to life with unprecedented speed, producing tanks, planes, and ships in numbers that astonished even seasoned generals. The United States, so recently an arsenal of democracy, was now a combatant, its industrial might harnessed to a global cause. From our vantage point in 2025, the attack on Pearl Harbor remains a defining hinge of history. It ended America's long debate over isolation and thrust the nation into a role it has carried ever since, that of a global power, whose fate is bound to the wider world. The ghost of that morning whispers, still, that complacency carries peril, that distance is no guarantee of safety, and that unity, though born of tragedy, can transform a nation. As 1941 gave way to 1942, America found itself in a new reality. The Depression was over, drowned in the tidal surge of mobilization. But the cost ahead would be measured in lives, sacrifice, and endurance. For the sailors entombed in the hull of the Arizona. For the families who listened to Roosevelt's voice tremble with controlled fury. For the millions who would soon march to foreign shores, Pearl Harbor was not only an attack, it was an awakening. The long night of uncertainty had ended. The war, at last, had come. The first months of 1942 were a blur of grief, fear, and frantic preparation. Pearl Harbor still smoldered in memory, the twisted hulks of battleships lying silent in the harbor, like tombstones for a vanished sense of invincibility. Families across the nation mourned sons, brothers, and husbands who had perished in the attack. Yet even in the shock, America moved with a speed and determination that astonished friend and foe alike. A nation that only months earlier had debated whether to arm Britain now threw itself fully into war. Its people discovering a unity forged in outrage and necessity. The military situation was grim. Japan's forces swept across the Pacific with alarming speed, seizing Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur, forced to abandon Corregidor, promised, "I shall return," a vow that captured both the despair and the defiance of the moment. In Europe, Hitler's armies stood deep in Soviet territory, and U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking American ships within sight of East Coast shores. The sense of vulnerability was palpable. Blackouts became common. Along the coasts, air raid drills were held in cities, and families taped windows against imagined bomb blasts. The war was no longer a distant echo. It was a shadow stretching across the continent. Roosevelt and his administration responded with sweeping mobilization. The War Production Board converted industries almost overnight. Automobile factories in Detroit stopped rolling out cars and began producing tanks, jeeps, and bombers. Shipyards expanded at a furious pace, launching Liberty ships faster than ever thought possible. Henry Kaiser's yards on the West Coast became legendary for producing vessels in weeks instead of months. Airplane production soared into the tens of thousands, transforming America's skies into an arsenal in motion at the same time. The selective service system swelled the armed forces. By the end of 1942, millions of men wore uniforms, training in camps that sprang up across the country. Posters urged enlistment, while films and radio broadcasts stirred patriotism. The image of Uncle Sam pointing his finger, "I want you now," carried urgency far beyond propaganda. Yet it was not only men who answered the call. Women, too, stepped into roles long denied them. They became welders, machinists, and riveters, immortalized in the figure of Rosie the Riveter with her rolled-up sleeves and determined gaze. For many women, the war was both duty and liberation, a chance to prove themselves in fields once reserved for men. Life on the home front transformed. Ration books became part of daily existence. Meat, sugar, gasoline, even shoes carefully allocated to ensure enough for the war effort. Families planted victory gardens to supplement their food. Children collected scrap metal, and communities held bond drives, raising billions to finance the conflict. Sacrifice was expected, but it was also embraced as a patriotic duty, to go without sugar in one's coffee, to walk instead of drive, to sew patches onto worn clothes. These became quiet badges of honor. For the first time since the Depression, Americans felt their daily struggles were part of a collective purpose, bound together by something larger than themselves. The emotional landscape shifted as well. Fear remained, especially in the Pacific, but it was mingled with determination. Roosevelt's speeches framed the war not only as retaliation for Pearl Harbor, but as a moral crusade. Democracy against tyranny, freedom against oppression, the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear were articulated as the goals for which America now fought. These ideals gave the struggle meaning beyond strategy or revenge, inspiring millions to endure sacrifices with a sense of righteousness. Early military engagements were costly. The fall of the Philippines in 1942 brought scenes of harrowing defeat, with American and Filipino soldiers enduring the brutal Botan Death March, and the Atlantic U-boat attacks sank hundreds of ships, threatening supply lines. Yet even in these setbacks, the machinery of mobilization continued to grind forward, building a momentum that would, in time, overwhelm the Axis. The Doolittle Raid, in April 1942, a daring bombing run over Tokyo, offered a spark of morale, proving that Japan was not invincible and that America could strike back. Small victories like these sustained hope during dark months. From our vantage point in 2025, the transformation of America in 1942 remains one of history's most remarkable feats. A nation still scarred by the Depression, divided by isolationist debates, and caught off guard by Pearl Harbor became, in a matter of months, the world's most formidable war machine. The lesson is not only about industrial might, but about collective will, the ability of a society to redirect its energies when survival demands it. The ghost of 1942 reminds us that resilience is not born in comfort, but in crisis, and that unity, however fragile, can propel a nation through its darkest hours. By the end of that year, America was no longer reeling, but rising. Its fleets were rebuilt, its armies growing, its factories roaring day and night. The Depression was over, swept aside by the demands of war. Ahead lay battles in North Africa, in the skies over Europe, and across the vast waters of the Pacific. The road would be long, the sacrifices immense, but the first steps had been taken. The nation that had wavered for years on the edge of involvement was now committed fully, its destiny bound to the outcome of the global struggle. By the summer of 1942, the Pacific had become a vast chessboard of uncertainty. Japan, fresh from its stunning victories at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and across Southeast Asia, appeared unstoppable. Its empire stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands, a crimson tide advancing relentlessly. American forces, though, mobilizing at unprecedented speed, were still reeling, their fleets scarred, their soldiers stretched thin. Morale hung in a fragile balance. Every headline of another Japanese advance gnawed at the American spirit. It was in this precarious moment that destiny converged on a small atoll in the Central Pacific, Midway. The Japanese High Command, emboldened by success, sought to deliver a crushing blow that would cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet once and for all. Their plan was audacious: draw the American carriers into a trap, overwhelm them with superior numbers, and secure dominance across the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, believed that by striking Midway, a vital outpost just over 1,000 miles from Hawaii, he could lure the Americans into decisive battle. The logic was sound: destroy the carriers, and America would be forced to negotiate or retreat. But the Japanese had underestimated their opponent. Unknown to Yamamoto, American codebreakers had cracked parts of the Japanese naval cipher. In hushed rooms in Pearl Harbor, cryptanalysts pored over intercepted messages, piecing together the plan. By late May, Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, knew that Midway was the target and prepared to meet the assault. It was a gamble. America still had only 3 operational carriers against Japan's 4, but it was a gamble Nimitz was willing to take. On June 4, 1942, the battle began. Waves of Japanese planes struck Midway Island, setting fuel depots ablaze and cratering runways. Yet even as the defenders scrambled, American aircraft took to the skies in desperate counterattacks. The first assaults, launched by torpedo bombers flying low and slow, were massacred by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Dozens of planes were shot from the sky, crews plunging into the sea, their sacrifice seemingly in vain. The waters churned with burning wreckage, and hope faltered. But fate, as so often in war, turned on timing. As Japanese carriers maneuvered, rearming their planes for a second strike, American dive bombers appeared out of a clear sky. In a matter of minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, the Akagikaga and Soryo, were engulfed in flames, their decks exploding, their crews leaping into the sea. Hours later, the 4th carrier Hiryu was struck and destroyed. In one day, the pride of Japan's naval air power was annihilated. More than 300 planes, and many of their most experienced pilots were lost, a blow from which Japan would never fully recover. For the Americans, the victory was staggering. The losses of Pearl Harbor had been avenged, the specter of Japanese invincibility shattered. Sailors cheered, commanders exhaled relief, and the nation, listening to Roosevelt's announcement, felt a surge of confidence it had not known since the war began. Historians would later describe Midway as the turning point of the Pacific War, the moment when initiative shifted from Japan to the United States. The significance went beyond ships sunk and planes destroyed. Midway proved that intelligence, planning, and courage could overcome superior numbers. It showed that the United States, though bloodied, could stand toe-to-toe with the mightiest foe and prevail. It lifted morale not only among troops, but among civilians, who now saw that victory was not a distant dream but a tangible possibility. The factories working day and night, the sacrifices of rationing and bond drives, the long hours of women, riveting steel, all of it now felt vindicated. Yet the cost was real. Many of the young aviators who dived through clouds of fire never returned. Their names filled telegrams delivered to homes across the nation, reminders that victory was purchased with blood. For families who had lost sons, Midway was not a triumph, but another chapter of grief. The paradox of war glory and loss entwined goat across the land. From the perspective of 2025, Midway endures as a study in resilience and the power of information. In an age when cyber warfare and intelligence dominate strategy, the lessons of broken codes and decisive gambles remain relevant. The ghost of Midway reminds us that wars are not won only by weapons but by minds, and that even in moments of peril, preparation and courage can turn the tide. By the end of 1942, America no longer fought with its back against the wall. The road ahead was long, stretching through Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. But the balance had shifted. The Pacific was no longer a Japanese lake. It was a contested battleground, and the United States was rising as the decisive force. Midway was more than a battle, it was the moment when despair gave way to determination. When America's future as a global power began to emerge from the smoke of burning carriers. While the Pacific dominated headlines with the shock of Pearl Harbor and the triumph of Midway, Roosevelt knew that the war could not be won in Asia alone. Germany, not Japan, was considered the greater threat, the core of the Axis, with its armies occupying most of Europe and its U-boats strangling the Atlantic lifeline. From the start, Roosevelt and Winston Churchill had agreed on a Germany-first strategy, even as Americans demanded vengeance against Japan. Yet bringing that strategy to life required a daring first step: the landing of American troops on the shores of North Africa. By late 1942, Britain was exhausted from years of solitary struggle. Its armies had fought bitterly in the deserts of Egypt and Libya, facing the formidable Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Supplies were stretched thin, morale was strained, and victory seemed precarious. Churchill pressed Roosevelt. America's soldiers must join the fight. Roosevelt agreed, but questions loomed. Where should they strike? France was too strong, the Atlantic Wall not yet assailable. The Soviet Union begged for a second front to relieve the pressure of Hitler's invasion, but an assault into Western Europe seemed impossible so soon. The compromise was North Africa. where Allied forces could test their strength, secure control of the Mediterranean, and gain experience before facing Germany in Europe itself. Thus was born Operation Torch, the first major American offensive of the war. On November 8, 1942, waves of Allied ships and armada of more than sane troops approached the coasts of French Morocco and Algeria. For many American soldiers, this was their baptism of fire, the first time they set foot on foreign soil. In combat, the landings targeted Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers, each bristling with defenses held by Vichy French forces loyal, at least nominally, to the collaborationist regime in Paris. The outcome was uncertain. Would the French resist? Would German forces intervene? Would the inexperienced American troops hold their nerve? The landings were chaotic, marked by confusion, miscommunication, and bursts of unexpected resistance. At Casablanca, naval battles raged as French warships engaged the American fleet. At Oran, American troops faced stiff opposition, learning in blood the price of inexperience. Yet within days, the balance shifted. Negotiations and Allied pressure persuaded many Vichy commanders to cease resistance and free French elements. Under Charles de Gaulle moved to join the Allied cause. The symbolism was immense. For the first time, American troops were fighting on the ground against Axis forces in the European theater. The landings secured vital ports and airfields, enabling the Allies to funnel men and supplies into the Mediterranean. Most importantly, the foothold in North Africa allowed a link-up with British forces advancing from Egypt, setting the stage for a decisive campaign against Rommel's Afrika Korps. The Americans, however, soon discovered how steep the learning curve would be. In February 1943, at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, inexperienced U.S. troops suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of Rommel. Their lines shattered, their morale shaken. Reports of the rout shocked the American public, who had grown accustomed to stories of triumph. Yet out of the defeat came growth. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, appointed Supreme Commander in North Africa, reorganized the command structure, brought in General George S. Patton to instill discipline, and hardened the American Army into a fighting force. By spring, the lessons of failure bore fruit, and alongside British allies, the Americans pushed Rommel back, eventually driving Axis forces from North Africa in May 1943. For ordinary Americans back home, Torch was both exciting and sobering. Headlines trumpeted the landings, the photographs of troops waiting ashore, the maps showing a widening front. Families felt pride that their sons were finally striking back against Hitler. But the casualty lists were also a shock, proof that the war would not be won easily or quickly. Letters from soldiers spoke of the heat of the desert, the strangeness of the land, the suddenness of combat. For many families, the war that had felt distant now felt achingly close. From our vantage point in 2025, Operation Torch represents a turning point in America's identity. No longer a hesitant giant, the United States had committed its sons and industry to the liberation of Europe. The challenges of North Africa forged the army that would later storm Normandy, fight in the Ardennes, and march into Germany itself. Torch also reflected the messy realities of coalition warfare, coordinating British, American, and Free French forces, managing politics as much as strategy, balancing egos as well as arms. The ghost of Torch reminds us that victory is not born in perfection, but in persistence, in learning from mistakes, in adapting under fire. By the end of 1942, the world had changed. In the Pacific, Midway had halted Japanese expansion. In North Africa, American troops had joined the struggle against Germany. The United States, once reluctant, was now fully engaged on two vast fronts. The Depression was a memory, replaced by the thrum of war production and the determination of a nation, united by sacrifice. The road to victory would be long and brutal, but the first steps had been taken, and the giant was awake, striding onto the world stage. By the spring of 1943, the sands of North Africa bore silent witness to a hard-fought transformation. Desert that once echoed with Rommel's bold maneuvers now lay scattered with the wreckage of German tanks and the graves of fallen soldiers. After months of bitter fighting, Allied forces, American, British, and Free French, finally drove the Axis out of Tunisia in May. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered, a blow so severe that Winston Churchill declared it the end of the beginning. For the United States, it was proof that its inexperienced army had matured, that the sting of Kasserine Pass had been avenged, and that American soldiers could stand shoulder to shoulder with seasoned allies. Victory in North Africa opened a new question: where next? Roosevelt and Churchill met with their generals and agreed on the next step in invasion of Italy, the soft underbelly of Europe. The logic was clear. Striking at Mussolini's regime could knock Italy out of the war, open the Mediterranean to Allied control, and begin the slow grind northward toward Germany. In July 1943, Operation Husky commenced. Allied forces landed on the shores of Sicily, waves of men and machines pouring onto beaches under cover of naval bombardment. The landings were chaotic, but they succeeded. Within weeks, Axis resistance collapsed, and the Allies seized the island. The impact was immediate. Mussolini, once the swaggering Duce of fascism, was deposed by his own council and arrested. Crowds in Rome cheered the news, weary of war and disillusioned by years of propaganda. Italy sought an armistice, though German troops quickly moved in, occupying much of the country and transforming it into a new battleground. The Allies pressed on, landing at Salerno in September and pushing northward. The campaign would prove anything but a march through soft underbellies. The mountainous terrain favored German defense, and battles like Monte Cassino and Anzio would drag on with brutal intensity. But the symbolism mattered. The fortress of Europe had been breached, and the tide of the war was turning. For American soldiers, Italy was a harsh awakening. The desert heat of North Africa gave way to mud, rain, and the rugged peaks of the Apennines. German troops, under the skilled command of Field Marshal Kesselring, fought stubbornly, turning villages and hills into fortresses. Casualties were heavy, progress slow, but the soldiers pressed on. Letters home spoke of exhaustion, of comrades lost, of towns reduced to rubble. Yet they also spoke of purpose. Every step northward was a step closer to Berlin. On the home front, the victories of 1943 breathed new energy into the war effort. Newspapers blazoned headlines of Mussolini's fall, of Allied troops marching through Sicilian towns, of the Axis surrender in Tunisia. Families who had worried through the dark days of 1942 now felt a cautious optimism. War bonds were purchased. With renewed fervor, factories roared louder than ever, and communities embraced sacrifice as a pathway to victory. The Depression, once the defining burden of American life, seemed a fading shadow compared to the all-consuming mobilization for war. Yet, even amid triumph, the costs were visible. The casualty lists grew longer, touching every town and neighborhood. Gold stars appeared in windows, symbols of sons who would never return. Japanese-American families, unjustly interned in camps across the West, read of victories achieved by soldiers who looked like their own sons, but were denied the same dignity at home. The contradictions of democracy at war were stark, but the unity of purpose remained. Roosevelt, in his speeches, framed the struggle as one of global liberation, and Americans largely believed him. Historians later marked 1943 as the hinge of World War II. In Russia, the Soviets won their titanic victory at Stalingrad, breaking the back of Hitler's Eastern armies. In the Pacific, American forces began their island-hopping campaign, seizing Guadalcanal and preparing to push westward. And in the Mediterranean, the United States had not only entered Europe, but toppled one of the Axis partners. The war was still far from over, but the momentum had shifted irrevocably. From our perspective, in 2025, the year 1943 holds enduring lessons. It shows how perseverance, coalition, and sacrifice can bend the course of history. It reminds us that victories are rarely easy, that progress often comes through grinding effort, setbacks, and the resilience of ordinary people. The ghost of 1943 whispers that even in the darkest struggles, tides can turn not suddenly, but through the steady pressure of collective will. By the close of the year, America was no longer the hesitant giant that had stumbled into war after Pearl Harbor. It was now a central pillar of the Allied effort, its armies tested in desert and mountain, its factories humming with relentless power, its people bound together by sacrifice. The Depression was gone, replaced by the shared determination to finish the fight. Ahead lay Normandy, the Pacific's vast oceans, and the final confrontation with tyranny. But the victories of 1943 had proven one thing beyond doubt. The Allies were on the march, and the end of the Axis, though distant, was now inevitable. The story we have wandered through tonight began in the heady glow of the 1920s. When jazz filled the air, stock tickers hummed, and Americans believed the good times would never end. Yet the mirage shattered in 1929, as markets collapsed, banks failed, and the streets filled with the silent shuffle of breadlines. For more than a decade, the nation lived with that ghost and invisible weight pressing on every kitchen table, every factory floor, every farm plowed in hope and fear. We followed the arc of that long night. Through Hoover's hesitation, Roosevelt's bold experiments, the promise and the backlash of the New Deal, the false dawn of 1937, and the steady realization that recovery would not be a single miracle, but a mosaic of endurance, reform, and sacrifice. We saw how politics became personal, how laws passed in marble halls were felt in soup kitchens and shantytowns, how relief checks brought dignity to broken families, how union protections changed the rhythm of workplaces, how social security transformed the meaning of old age. We saw that leadership, at its best, is not only about policies, but about trust. Roosevelt's fireside chats, soothing fears, as much as his acts of legislation eased suffering. And then, as if history were not content with one crisis, another storm gathered. From Germany, Italy, and Japan came the thunder of aggression, testing not only America's economy, but its very place in the world. For years, Americans clung to isolation, believing that oceans could shield them. But the fall of France, the bombs over London, and finally, the flames of Pearl Harbor shattered that illusion. The Depression, at last, was ended not by words or experiments alone, but by the massive mobilization of a nation at war. Tanks, ships, planes, and soldiers poured forth. And in the crucible of conflict, America discovered both its strength and its new destiny. The war was long and brutal. North Africa's deserts, Italy's mountains, the beaches of Normandy, the islands of the Pacific, but out of it came something extraordinary. The United States emerged, not only victorious, but transformed. From a nation humbled by economic collapse, to a global power capable of shaping the century ahead. The Great Depression and the Second World War together forged the institutions, the expectations, and the resilience that would define modern America. And now, as we sit here in 2025, the ghost of 1929 has not vanished. It lingers in headlines about inflation, whispers in debates over government debt, flickers in the unease of families balancing bills in uncertain times. The echoes of breadlines can be heard in the crowded waiting rooms of food banks. The arguments over Roosevelt's New Deal repeat in today's disputes over stimulus checks, healthcare, and student debt relief. Even the controversies over the Supreme Court and presidential power find their ancestors in the battles of the 1930s. History is not a circle, but it rhymes, its cadences carrying across generations. Yet the ghost is not only a warning, it is also a teacher. It reminds us that despair is not destiny, that crises are endured not by the strongest alone, but by communities, by neighbors who share, by families who persist. It reminds us that bold leadership matters, but so does the quiet resilience of millions of ordinary people. It reminds us that progress is never linear, that setbacks, like the Roosevelt recession, can precede renewal, that defeats like Kasserine Pass can lay the groundwork for victories like Normandy. When we look at America today, facing challenges of inequality, political division, technological disruption, and a world once again uneasy, it is tempting to see only the cracks. But history whispers that cracks can be mended, that out of depression can come reform, out of hardship can come unity, and out of fear can come courage. The Great Depression did not destroy America, it reshaped it. The war did not break the nation, it revealed its strength. And so too can the trials of our own time become the forge of something better. Imagine, as you drift into rest, the faces of those who lived through the 1930s and 1940s. A farmer in Iowa, watching clouds of dust swallow his crops, who still found the will to plant again. A mother in Chicago, patching her children's shoes and stretching meals with dignity. A young man in the CCC, planting trees that still shade us today. A factory worker in Detroit, turning from cars to tanks, his hands blistered but his pride renewed. A soldier on the beaches of Sicily, frightened but determined. A sailor at Midway, watching flames rise from the enemy but holding steady at his post. They were ordinary people, yet together they carried the weight of history, and so do we. In the quiet of this evening, as New York's skyline glimmers against the August night, the story of the Great Depression and its aftermath is not just a tale of economics and war, it is a lullaby of resilience. It tells us that no matter how dark the night, there is always a morning. That even when hope feels like an ember, it can ignite again. That unity, however fragile, can sustain nations through storms. So rest easy, dear listener. The ghosts of history do not haunt too terrified. They haunt to remind, to teach, to guide. America has faced collapse before, and it has risen. It has faced tyranny before, and it has endured. The road ahead may be uncertain, but the footsteps behind us prove that the journey is possible. If this story has carried you gently into the arms of sleep, let its final message linger. History's darkest nights are never the end, only the prologue to dawn. Thank you for listening, for walking with me through the long arc from 1929 to 1945, and for carrying its lessons into 2025. If you found comfort or meaning in this journey, I invite you to like this story, to subscribe for the next, and to share your own thoughts in the comments below. Every voice adds to our collective lullaby. Good night, and may your dreams be softer than history's storms.